Call to order.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all.
Any comments from the assembly? We have two pieces of correspondence to review. I think one was ERD application extension matter. Anything of special note on that? Doesn't look like it. And then an XLT extension letter. They have a time extension until June 30th, 2023. Now, I'll take a look at the minutes of the previous meeting on November 15th.
Motion to accept the minutes as written.
Do I have a second? All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, first plan review that we have is for lots 27 and 28, Morgantown Business Park sketch plan submittal.
Hey, good evening.
Evening.
Neil Fisher with the Henkin Group. It's been a little while since I've been here. I think last time I was here was about 2 years ago. We did the Viwinko project, their 80,000 square foot expansion of their facilities. But we have several lots that are still, am I in your way?
No, I'm
Okay.
good.
We have several lots that are still out there, and we have a fair amount of interest in activity for whether it's warehousing, office space, really it's a combination of the uses. So we put together a sketch plan that I just want to introduce to you tonight. We're working on expanding this, preparing land development plans, and I'll come back and we'll talk about that probably in about 2 months or so. But when you look at the site in Morgantown Business Park there, you're familiar with where the water authority is on Hemlock, right? When we did the Viwinko expansion, we had a lot of excess fill, and down at the end of the cul-de-sac really ended up creating a building pad that's pretty close to being on grade at this point. That's a site that is easily ready, becomes available for future prospects. And really what we want to do is a lot of, I'll say customers for us, it's all about timing and they want to be very quick. So what we want to do is come through the development process, get things ready, and be prepared to present our approved development ready site to these prospects. So we chose the end of the cul-de-sac there next to the water authority. We have 2 lots that are together. One's a 3-acre lot, one's a 7.5-acre lot. And the way they're situated on there really lends themselves to a shared driveway where loading can be shared off of that common driveway, and then parking areas that will front the building and provide opportunities where the building could be easily divided and have multiple tenants within that building. So that's the sketch plan. I know we got a review letter, and we'll take all those comments into account. We'll revise, make some tweaks to the layout, and then prepare development plans and come back before you. But really, all I wanted to do tonight was introduce the concept, see if the commission had any comments, questions, concerns. But as I said, our goal is to be at a point where we could be shovel ready and really beat out any competition when it comes to bringing a tenant into the business park.
Just one thing I'd like to say is, on this lot to the right,
This one here, the 3-acre lot, yep.
right where in between the parking spaces in their parking lot, that's our access point, somewhere right around there, right now to the backside of Penwood for maintenance.
Okay.
For the township. So
Is there,
there's actually
is
a
there
road.
something to be maintained in the back of Penwood there?
Yes, there's the walking trail, which
Okay.
goes right along the backside of that building. And then there's also, retention ponds
Okay.
and basins. So,
So you'd like to have access?
well, it would be nice.
Sure.
Because that's,
I'll take a look at it. There is a sewer easement as well. The sewer comes through here, and actually we'll reroute a portion of that sewer line to make sure, so the sewer is on one side and the building is on the other side. And maybe that's a good location for a connection.
yeah,
Come down through the loading area and then have access.
yeah, because we take small dump trucks, tractors, I mean, nothing
Wait a
huge,
second, you're
but,
using our property, get back there.
if you look down there, if you drive down there, you'd see the access road that we've
Right.
been using for,
Sure.
it's pretty close, it's probably right, actually in the footprint of the building. But,
No, we'll take a
just
look at
food
that.
for thought.
Yeah, no, listen, you're gonna have access through the sewer easement, you have rights over that, so, I'll look to try to connect the two. and make sure the grades work as well, so there's a fair amount of grade change coming across these two sites, so we'll have to take that into account as well.
Yeah.
Okay. Hey, well, thank you, I'll see you in, like I said, probably about 2 months, I'll be back. Okay. Have a good night.
Next up, we have the Berks Homes ERD plan revision. I think he's on, so.
I am. I am here.
I don't think. Okay. You too.
Merry Christmas.
You're going to abstain, you just announced.
I am going to abstain from this part of the meeting.
You can have one. You can have some. Happy holidays. Christmas, right?
I'm just checking, Michael, can you hear us all right?
I can hear you just fine. There's a little bit of background noise, but I can hear you. Can you hear and see me?
Yep.
All right. Well, before we jump in, I just want to thank everyone for allowing me to participate remotely. As I mentioned earlier to Joan and Scott, we had our firm holiday party on Friday, and at least 4 people have now tested positive for COVID. And though I tested negative, I have a sore throat and runny nose. So rather than risk exposing any of you to whatever I have, if anything, I thought this was the better way to go. So again, thank you very much.
Well, Michael, I think just to start off here, the applicant did provide a revised plan after our last meeting. That came in 2 weeks ago. We had looked at that internally, re-reviewed that, issued that letter today. Again, I apologize that it was issued today. I know it doesn't give everybody a very long chance to look at it, but we're doing so because this will be at this time before the hearing, which is permitted to be as close to the time when the plan was submitted. They did provide an extension, but as of right now, that's January 10th, so this would be the last meeting for the planning commission to get together, review the plan, and provide whatever recommendation that you feel is necessary. And at this time, that's the time frame we have. That's what we're looking at. So with that said, I think if this is the opportunity we have to review that, and we're looking towards the planning commission to provide some type of a recommendation. I'll let Michael speak a little more to that if now is appropriate. Sure. Towards the end, but yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I can just provide some procedural framework here, and then there were some legal issues that came out of Scott's first review and our discussion at the Planning Commission meeting in November, so I'll just touch on those preliminarily. We can get into more detail on them as we roll through the review letter, which Scott issued today. But essentially, we have this planned residential development application before us. The board ultimately will hold its hearing and will either approve the application as submitted, approve the application with conditions, or deny the application as submitted. So if you bring that back down to the planning commission, your duty is to discuss the application with the applicant and then to make a written report, a recommendation to the board, which tracks those three options, either to recommend approval of the application as submitted based on the information which the applicant has provided, recommend to the board that it approve the application with conditions, or recommend to the board that it deny the application as submitted. This is a PRD, so by definition, we would expect to see less detail than would be the case in a land development application. But even with that standard, even by that standard, our review of the application, and I think you see this in Scott's letter as we go through it, and you'll hear it now in my comments, our review of the application leads us to the conclusion that the amount of information and the scope of information that the applicant has provided, even by PRD standards, is not enough to allow the planning commission to make an intelligent and full analysis of the application and its impacts on the township. And that's specifically, or especially, I should say, especially the case with regard to open space, stormwater management, and traffic, although to be clear, there are other issues, obviously, in Scott's letter. But if I had to pick three things that, where I think that's particularly the case, it would be with regard to open space, stormwater management, and traffic. Obviously, we're going to hear from the applicant in just a moment, and we'll go through the review letter. But I do just want to touch on a few of the legal issues that came out of the November Planning Commission meeting. The first is with regard to section 628.13C1 of the ordinance, and that's in Scott's letter, it's comment number 10. That's the requirement in the zoning ordinance that open space be or measure 1 acre in contiguous area as opposed to disjointed components of open space. The applicant's position is that ordinance number 313 repealed the requirement for open space to measure at least 1 acre in area. In other words, to have cohesive units of open space as opposed to half an acre here or a quarter acre there. We disagree. From a legal perspective, as the Planning Commission solicitor, we disagree. The ordinance number 313 is silent on this issue, and my interpretation of ordinance number 313, when compared to the earlier PRD ordinance, is that 1 acre minimum remains applicable to PRD applications like the one we have before us. So there's a legal disagreement there. The applicant obviously has its position. That's my interpretation of the situation. The applicant has said that it would request a modification, essentially a waiver from the 1 acre requirement, if my legal interpretation is the correct one. So you have the benefit of my legal interpretation, and now as a planning rationale, we can discuss, or we will discuss when we get there, whether or not a modification is appropriate. But I just wanted to give you my legal interpretation first. The second issue I wanted to touch on is whether or not stormwater management facilities can be counted toward the 25% minimum open space, common open space requirement. And again, here I interpret the ordinance to not allow for areas that will be dedicated or devoted, I should say, to stormwater management to count as open space. The Commonwealth Court has actually considered this very question in a case, check the case as Gallons 2, and I can provide you the site for that if you'd like. It's 260 A2D 1029, case out of Indiana County. Where the question before the Commonwealth Court was whether or not areas that are devoted to stormwater management can also count as common open space in the context of a PRD application. Almost exactly the fact pattern that we would have here. And the Commonwealth Court held that under a definition of the term common open space, which is identical to the definition in the Carnarvon Township ordinance, that you should not count stormwater management areas as common open space. So we have to have a discussion tonight about what that would mean. I don't know what the calculation of common open space is for this development if you were to not count the stormwater management areas, but presumably we'll hear and talk about that as well. The next legal issue that I want to raise is whether or not the applicant has provided sufficient information to allow Scott and the Planning Commission to make a determination, or a recommendation, I should say, to the board about the feasibility of water, sanitary sewer, and stormwater management. Now again, this is PRD, so we're not looking for the level of detail you would expect in a land development application, but what we have on the plans is are areas that are labeled as stormwater management area, but there's no ability for the township engineer or the planning commission, or presumably for the board for that matter, to be able to determine whether or not those are feasible areas or whether they're simply just labeled as future stormwater management areas. The same would apply for water and sanitary sewer service. We think that for water and sanitary sewer, those are relatively easy to address. For water, it may be as easy as obtaining a will serve letter, and for sanitary sewer, it may be as easy as confirming capacity. But as of right now, that information has not been provided to the Planning Commission. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to note generally before we get into each individual comment is that there's been no open space management plan submitted with the application. Section 598M2 of the zoning ordinance expressly requires an open space management plan to be submitted with a PRD application, but one has not been provided. So those are the general legal issues that I wanted to point out. They obviously overlap to some extent with to a great extent, with the engineering issues. I just wanted to set the table with my interpretations of a couple of the issues from the November meeting. Again, in the absence of an extension from the applicant, as Scott pointed out, the Planning Commission will have to make a recommendation to the board prior to the January 10th hearing. What that means as a practical matter, I think, is that we will be in a situation where we're going to have this discussion tonight. I will take very detailed notes, and I will work with Scott to prepare a draft report. And then it would be my recommendation, again, in the absence of a grant of an extension from the applicant, that the Planning Commission schedule a special meeting prior to the 10th of January, at which the Planning Commission could adopt, obviously make edits to, and then ultimately adopt the report that we would draft for the Planning Commission. So adopt that as a report of the Planning Commission, and then we would deliver that to the board at or prior to the hearing on the 10th. Of course, if the applicant would be willing to grant an extension to allow the Planning Commission to formally adopt its report at the January Planning Commission meeting, a special meeting wouldn't be necessary. But again, in the absence of an extension, we think that that would be the procedurally appropriate way to go. So that's sort of my overview, and I'll turn it back over to you guys in the room to kick off the discussion.
You want to start, Scott? And we had a couple letters, and then your letter that directly responded to
Um,
your submission. Wherever you
Sure, I
want to
mean,
start.
we can jump right into the letter. I don't know, with you guys present here to discuss this, have the letter, if you would just wanna approach it comment by comment here.
Yeah.
I think probably that might not be the quickest way through it, but I think it's probably the most appropriate way to kind of approach to this.
Maybe just put one more stack of paper in front of you there. In going through the review letter, there were a number of instances that he indicated that a waiver would be required, that, you know, the plan wasn't compliant. So I basically put together a written request for modifications that address points relative to your review letter. So if I can just
Gotcha.
get you a copy of that.
Okay.
How do you think best to proceed?
Just go through that. All right, well then we'll jump into the letter here. I'd say the first comment, there are a few comments here where if they did adequately address the comment, it just simply says comment addressed. Unless there's a question of what that was and wanting to go through it, I'll skip through those. Berks County Planning Commission did issue a letter, although I didn't reiterate all the comments after the revised plan came out. Some of the comments that still seemed applicable to the plan, I put on here to just have the discussion tonight about those. The first comment would be, that they saw the road width as, not recommended for on-street parking. If it's prohibited, they should provide adequate visitor parking. I added on our comment that it seemed like this was a discussion point with planning commission, at least seeing some of the past, minutes and correspondence there that occurred with the preliminary plan. And
I believe they saw the plan and had the 24 that was incorrect. Is that correct, Justin?
I believe so, yeah.
It was what was submitted, the first set of plans that was submitted. If you recall, we incorrectly had 24-foot wide streets on, they were gonna be
Yes,
28
yep,
to 30.
yep.
So
The width of
just
the
keep in
thing,
mind, the
yeah.
planning commission was looking at 24 wide streets. They have not seen the revised plan that corrected the dimensions.
so I think, to that point, that's true. There is, all the roadways in here have a minimum width of 28 feet,
Correct.
correct?
Yep.
And then road A, which is the extension of Willow Glen, and then the extension of, tell me what comes out of Highcroft.
That's road B, but we are,
Road-
yeah, we
Yeah.
do wanna allow parking on one side of road B.
Yeah, so
That's
road
30.
Road B from, where it intersects with Road A, up into Highcroft in that area, the width is 30, so is Road A. The idea was Road B up towards Highcroft to allow for parking on one side, that's what's proposed. And then the lower half of Road B as you approach Main Street, obviously that is restricted from parking it. The widths change a little bit, and, will, as a review comes in, I'm sure, from PennDOT, just of where that needs to end up. So that's the width. As far as parking, I think this was just one of the comments here, and there's other parts with the parking where it got into the proposed snow emergency parking on the commercials and having that included, but I guess in the previous plan that had been reviewed and looked at, there were additional parkings, at least in the townhouse area. I know that has been reduced, and I think that's a question that should at least be posed there on why there weren't additional parking spaces, understanding in my end that the minimum requirements per the ordinance that was adopted, those parking requirements aren't met. but I think the question and discussion previously was why, or could there be additional parking added around the townhouses? And I don't know, I wanna speak for you guys if that's still a question on what you're looking at.
At the townhouses, how many parking spaces are there per unit?
I believe, what is it, 3? 4? So two in each driveway, and then each townhouse has a 2-car garage, so 2 in the garage, 2 in the driveway. And I believe the requirement's 3 per unit for the townhouse?
Yeah, I think parking requirements overall, I think the single-family units with the parking, not taking any on-street parking into consideration is meeting the required.
Correct.
And
So the townhouse would be in excess
I don't want
by
to try to guess, yeah,
86
5,
spaces.
yep. And then the townhouses have an excess of
86,
No,
1
I'm
per
sorry.
unit. Yeah.
Yeah,
That, it's probably on the plan, I don't have it, but then, for parking for that area, would it be just one side of the street, or how would that work? Would
there is no parking proposed for any street
No on-street parking?
except for Road B from Road A at the intersection above the signal up towards High Croft. That section there is proposed as one side parking permit. So all the others have no on-street parking. There's 5 spaces inside the townhouse area that have parking spaces in addition to what's provided on each lot. let's say.
It's the flip side, right? They're all streets have on one side, except for Red Acre.
It was 28-foot wide, it was.
Yeah.
So it is one.
streets,
Yes,
not-
yes.
That was
Not to
kind
be
of,
dedicated, are 28 wide.
Yes, our only Road A
Side.
does not have parking on it. The rest do have parking on
Okay.
one side.
and I think that was kind of,
If that's
One of the
confusing, we
comments
can
there was
clarify
a
that
little-
on the plan.
well, I think we're talking about it here, and I think if it's clarification, then I think we're all right to just make sure we're on the same page here. But that's, so I misspoke there, so Road A has no parking on it.
Correct.
All the others, with the exception of the 2 roads that approach Main Street, at least the stub streets.
Yes, H and the lower half of B
Okay,
do not have it.
so all of them would, I'm sorry, all of them.
But the townhouses do not have on-street parking.
Yeah, I'm sorry, thank you for correcting that when I was. So it's the townhouses that have 5 spaces but no, off-street parking, and the ones that are available at the units, no on-street parking. All the other streets have one side proposed for the parking.
Okay.
So unless there's any other questions on that one, we'll just kind of keep going through the comments. One of the other comments was the clusters, the cluster mailbox in the townhome is proposed opposite the sidewalk. It actually seemed like a relevant comment to try to put that with the sidewalk, or is there a better reason behind not having that there?
I think it was placed there because we have 5 spaces next to it, so you're able to pull in off the road to access the mailbox cluster. Understanding that it would be logical to be on the sidewalk side, but that's why we flipped it, because we can provide parking there too.
Yeah,
So I think there are advantages, disadvantages to either scenario.
yeah, I think there's an argument in either side.
And you're okay with cluster boxes in the right of way, correct? Probably only relevant on Road B.
I would
Yeah.
assume you probably typically, anytime I've ever seen them, they're typically within the right of way. I don't think there's anything prohibiting them from being in the right of way, but.
There's also a post office coordination that needs to be kept in mind. They have kind of fond say where those boxes go, the cluster boxes. We just went through it in 2 different townships. One of them was actually this post office box, or post office.
Do you think they'd have any feedback on which site it is and relevant to the parking spaces and sidewalk then?
They might. They don't determine it locally. It goes to a distribution person, Philadelphia or Harrisburg or somewhere.
Yeah,
So this would be an item from my perspective that if we're keeping a list of potential proposed conditions to the board, the planning commission may want to consider a condition that either requires that the township be involved in the discussions with the postal service, or to make a more specific condition about where the recommendation for a condition about where the planning commission thinks the mailbox cluster or clusters should be located. Or we can simply move on.
Well, the question I had, that road that goes behind the commercial, is there parking permitted on that road?
That's strictly a service road for deliveries. We put that in for deliveries, so there's to eliminate conflicts between delivery vehicles in the front where the pedestrian and the patrons are gonna be. So we put that in back. We prefer not to have a road back there, but it seems to be the most efficient and safest way to handle deliveries.
My concern was wherever we would place a box, if it's along that road, that it wouldn't be somebody's parked in front of it, so they couldn't get it.
I'd say if you tell us where you like it, if you think it's the best, we'll fight with the post office to try and keep that location.
How many extra boxes do they plan on having?
there's 5.
There's 5.
There are no mailboxes though on Road A. On Willow Bend Road, I don't think anybody wants cluster boxes on that road. So it would be on all the sidewalks. We're not showing any on Road A, I don't believe.
No.
Okay.
Since there's no parking on Road A, I'm thinking about that.
I guess my opinion on the mailbox cluster, not to stay on it too long, would just, I almost think that the other mailboxes, they're shown on the same side as the sidewalk. It seems like you have access from a sidewalk to get to those. In this situation, you have 5 spaces where people can get to it, but you kind of have to go through the road to get there. And you're kind of forcing people into the road to get to the mailboxes on everything.
Yeah, we'll just,
I'm just thinking that,
you wanna put the sidewalk or just put the mailbox?
Yeah, we flip the sidewalk.
It's less lane for sidewalk.
Yeah, it's not sidewalk too. Yeah, so we'll just flip the sidewalk to,
my opinion would be it's better to have it there than you have access to, and it's consistent with the rest of the plan, so at least
Sure.
you're, in that situation, you're kind of giving people more of a safe space to get out of the way of traffic. That's just my
So you're good with flipping the sidewalk?
opinion. I mean, if that's how it works out best for you, then, yeah, I mean, that's kind of, you guys take a look at it and see how it works out, if it's best to do that, or
You go with
flip
that.
it back, I think. Yeah. Unless there's any other comments on that one. The next comment, pedestrian crossing should be across Road A. I think this is with the planning commission as well. There really isn't any proposed except for Road A and Road B at the main entrance there. But I think partially one of the concerns is there's gonna be a draw to the other side of the road, and there needs to be a safe access point.
sure.
I had suggested maybe Road D and the center road as far as the three that run vertically there, and then, the townhouse road, simply because that was also consistent with what the planning commission was asking. I think you do that, you also have the opportunity for, stop control to allow them to safely cross, and I think you kind of allow some, stops along that road instead of one long throughway as well. But if you're gonna add the crossings, I think you need to consider the stop controls there too. So, that was what I was thinking.
I think that's okay, we don't have any problem with it.
So you're thinking, Scott, just strictly across Road A for any crosswalks?
Yeah, I think that's, as opposed to crossing other roadways?
So you're saying one at the town owned and one road D, coming down Road D, to get into the commercial?
Yeah. Again,
You want all four of them?
that's my suggestion. I mean, if you look at it and there's a reason not to do the two of them, or one works out better than the other, it's,
Maybe one as well, crossing Road D just south of Road A, since that section may be high traffic.
isn't there one crossing Road A there already?
Right. This direction, or this direction. Yeah, we have 2 ramps there already.
Okay, I was gonna say that there was something for that intersection. Yeah, I think to the county's comment, and as well as just speaking to the fact that there's gonna be people crossing to get to commercial property, regardless, whether it's that commercial property or they're just going across Main Street, you're gonna have somebody walking, and I think you need to provide that space.
You're saying a north to south crosswalk?
Across Road A.
So you don't think we should have a sidewalk from like the commercial area to the lake to cross over to the Morgantown crossings?
I think,
There's one.
yes, there is, and I think the idea is to push them over to the signal if they're gonna cross anywhere.
Okay.
I think PennDOT's gonna say the exact same thing, to try to minimize it there. I think, what does the rest of the commercial lots look like with the sidewalk? I think there needs to be some, but there's none shown or proposed. I think that does get into some of the comments later. There's a section about traffic and, making sure it's safe for pedestrians in the area. But we'll touch on that later, but yeah, I think, yes, it needs to cross Main Street as well, but that'll be recommended to push over to the traffic signal at crossings.
We're showing that now.
Yeah,
Yes, correct.
We're showing what I believe PennDOT indicated they would like to see.
again, I think those are suggestions both from the county as well as, this review letter. And then I think to look at that as far as a safety concern or what other controls would need to be added, I think that's just goes along with where you place that. To keep moving, D speaks to the homeowners association. If there is one, then any documentation should be provided and reviewed by the township. The subject properties in clean and green and should be coordinated with the county appropriately. I don't think there's any action other than it's just a statement. Again, I think one of the comments they had in their review letter, I didn't include it here, but I think it speaks to what Michael was speaking to. They were recommending that any approval by the township would be preceded by the township being satisfied with a stormwater design. Again, I think there's stormwater areas shown, but to the extent anybody could say that it satisfies or meets a requirement or will provide adequate stormwater for the area, it's just unable to do that at this time.
So, you know, stormwater testing is gonna happen after the first of the year. The reason why is because the airplanes are still there until the end of the year. And there are some test pits that are, in the vicinity of the runway. So that's why we didn't do the testing in this school.
Gotcha.
It's all priced up, it's all ready to go.
Okay. Alrighty, I think that the number 3 gets into, some of the comments we already talked about in detail. I think these modifications are very, the modification requests are very similar to what we had in the very first time through. Number 3 speaks to that they recommend at least 20% of each of the dwellings in each stage and try to continue that same ratio. As we talked about before, it's, for the residential, it's 60% stage 1, 21% and then 19 in the 3 stages that are proposed. And then the townhomes and the commercial is 100% in phase 1, is what you're still proposing. Yeah.
One of the questions.
I don't know if you wanna touch on that and discuss it again at all, but.
Well, one of the questions on, that you and I talked about a little bit is, the staging is for the vertical portion of the construction. As far as infrastructure and site work, that's not staged. That can be, you know, because to try and, if this is really an important issue, to try and meet the 20%, and that modification isn't something that you're gonna consider, does the infrastructure fall into the staging as well?
I mean, you're asking about working ahead on the
I think it's a
infrastructure.
I think it's a good question because it speaks to, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, they're looking at if the balance of the percentages of housing is not 20% and consistent throughout, or a consistent number throughout, which would be more along the lines of what's being asked. If it's not consistent, can the infrastructure at least then be built, meaning the roads, and provide the loop road? I think in this situation would mostly be the loop road for the townhomes. If the townhomes were gonna be asked to stage that out in construction.
The difficulty is to try and meet what's required. It's very difficult to be able to stop the infrastructure right at the end of that stage, because you got manhole runs, you got water lines that need to be connected. They won't service until they have it loaded and tested, and so and the water authorities don't necessarily want to do 400 feet at a time. They want to get a lot of main in so they can have it looped. So if infrastructure isn't an issue, then is there an issue with the staging of the vertical to stay within the parameters? I guess the question is, how important is it to you guys that the 20% and the 10% variance is necessary? So if it's necessary in your minds, then infrastructure is something separate, and infrastructure doesn't comply with the staging. You see, Sean, you're shaking your head, so I must be saying something that's making a little bit of sense.
Well, no, yeah, I understand it. It's more efficient to do all that first. I guess I don't know the spirit of how that was written. I understand what they're trying to do. They don't wanna have something that, you know, if something happens along the way that's, all over the place and only 10% completed. Better to have just, one section uncompleted or at a various stage of completion. I don't know how infrastructure fits into that.
I would actually think if they wanted to complete the infrastructure prior to the buildings, I don't think that's in violation of that section requirement. I think the idea, like you were speaking to, what's the spirit of, what's the intent, what do they really try to do? I think the thought was with the PRD being a mixed use, to try to keep that consistently occurring throughout each phase so that you have a balance as each phase progresses. That's the way I read it. And I think if it varies from that and a modification is considered, the question is, if they did the townhouses and the commercial up front, as they're proposing, is that a detriment anyway? If it's not, and in this case, and you're getting more of it up front, that to me is probably the bigger question. I don't see that the infrastructure, I think the way they lay out the staging, other than the townhomes, the infrastructure can be staged, or the infrastructure can go along with each stage. I think it's just really the townhomes. 'Cause if you
It's
break that up
primarily the
into-
townhomes, there may be some, like, extending a manhole run, for example, because it stops short of an intersection or where the next manhole is. But there's like two separate divisions working here. There's townhomes and there's singles, so I think I kinda heard that townhomes and the commercial would be in stage one, but there's also single families in stage one as well. So, and that's the section that connects.
I was thinking it's the
Road.
60% of residential development is 60% single family homes, but all of the townhomes in stage one, correct?
I believe that's what our current total is.
I mean, just looking
That's
at the
what we were-
staging thing, that's what the staging areas, that's how I read it. And then stage 2 and stage 3 is really only single family residential.
Yeah, correct.
That's correct.
Yep.
Yeah. So I think stage 1 is 100% townhomes, 100% commercial, 60% single family. And then it's the 2119 breakdown for 2 and 3, single family homes.
That's what we originally
Yeah.
proposed, correct.
So that's the modification request for that one. I personally don't think that infrastructure would violate that section of it, would require a modification. I
And
think
the
you
letter
can
of
build
credit
that
or the bond, the surety would be for the infrastructure that's gonna be installed. That's irrespective, the number of homes that are being built has no impact on the letter of credit. It's all infrastructure. So it's
Yeah.
gonna be, there's gonna be financial surety to support it if you're worried that we're gonna leave town.
I would think the same with, they talked about, I think it's the open space section where it talks about that the township would be provided an easement or access covenant or something along those lines if it were beyond a staging area. If some of it was built in advance of a certain stage, that would be provided. I feel like that's,
We would give, I think you're looking for a blanket easement to the township, and that's pretty normal.
yeah, I don't think there's really any concerns with but the infrastructure on that end. I think it's the same thing, but, so I think really that modification is still, the request, and that's the breakdown, so that you're aware. I don't know if, you have any comments on this, or?
I mean, it makes sense to go ahead with the infrastructure part, not have it at the stage line.
Yeah. Michael, I'm just curious on this end of it, is there need to try to address these one by one as we go if there is a request for modification? Since we're really dealing with tonight as kind of the planning commission and their decision? I think you might be muted.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm still muted. I think what probably makes the most sense is to continue the conversation, unless any member of the commission has any comments or concerns from what appears to be the consensus. I'm sensing that on this issue, the consensus is, as long as the applicant would put in the infrastructure all at one time, the planning commission wouldn't have any objection to the modification to allow the vertical construction to be along the staging schedule that the applicant suggests. Is that a good read of where the commission members are?
Yes, for me.
Okay. So yeah, I don't think we need to stop and take a vote on each modification request, but if anybody feels strongly that, contrary to where the consensus is, we'll make a note of it.
All right, thank you. So that's number 3 with the modification request. The number 4 is another modification request. The requirement being 50%, at least 50% of the dwellings proposed shall be rented or sold prior to the construction of commercial. Again, this modification request is because the commercial is simultaneously going to be built with stage 1, and I don't necessarily, I think the idea here is that they may not have 50% sold. Well, I would ask you to just elaborate on that one before I
Well,
make the assumption how to describe it.
The intent is that's what we heard the township wanted there was the commercial. So we figured that would be something that should be in the first stage. Whether we have all of them sold or not, I don't know. We probably a good chance we won't, but we would still do the improvements and the pads. Depending, say a majority of them were sold, we would know what we have left to prepare. The ones that would be sold, they would be prepared. We're not, I don't think you wanna see the commercial area staged. Half the parking put in now and the other half put in later. I think when we get into the parking and the infrastructure for, the stormwater and the water and the sewer and earthwork and paving would be all done at once.
Yeah, so I come to this obviously in the blind, other than just reviewing ordinance number 313. The board made an express finding in the background section of the ordinance. Reads, the Board of Supervisors has been presented with a market study that demonstrates an overabundance of commercial and industrial space. I read that as militating obviously in favor of wanting to see residential either in conjunction with or before commercial. But the fact that the applicant is proposing to build all of the towns and a not insignificant portion of the singles simultaneously with the commercial suggests that, there's really little likelihood of ending up with another commercial strip here without any residential being constructed. Again, looking at it in a vacuum, it seems clear to me that that's what the board was trying to avoid. So I don't really see any reason not to approve or recommend approval of that modification, as long as the towns and that component of the singles is actually constructed simultaneously with the commercial.
Which to that point would probably be a condition, if anything, Michael.
Yeah.
I generally agree, probably move to the next one then. Another modification request, this is, the gross stage residential density may be varied from stage to stage by a maximum of 10% of the gross residential density of the entire PRD as approved. On this, as we've discussed, the staging, that variance is more than 10%. It's looking at, for the residential, it's a 60%, 20%, 19 for the single family homes. The townhomes is 100% up front as proposed, so.
Well, I guess if you're okay with the first one, this is kind of moot.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good way to summarize it. I mean, this kind of
It's been covered.
speaks to this, it touches on the open space requirement going along with it, but, number 6 really speaks to a higher level schedule that could be provided at a final plan. I think we're well aware of what their preliminary plan is, which is the requirement of the tentative plan. So, number 7 is another modification request. It was a modification request. This simply spoke to, they were looking at putting in some of the trees after generally more than just a single stage was put in. But I think after the last discussion, that was withdrawn and it was gonna be.
Make it work.
The landscape as needed,
We'll meet the requirement.
stage to stage, to make sure that it satisfy that requirement. Number 8, just that kind of, that speaks to requirements as they move forward. Not necessarily with the tentative plan, but a requirement on another stage. 9's addressed. Number 10 speaks to what Michael had discussed about the open space requirements. Some of the comment was about providing access to open space areas. And one of the comments that I had in here was open space area L and A still do not have a access point to them. I think we can look at these. I think if you would, Justin, touch on these, look at them, discuss what, as far as the access to the open space areas. A was the one behind the townhomes to the north, which is generally stormwater areas, so as shown, I don't know.
Yeah, so A includes all of this here in green. So there is a trail going along the western end of the open space A. Obviously, it's not going into these areas, but part of open space A is being, access is being provided for it.
Yeah, I think generally looking at it is, some of these areas that are provided, do they need access to all of them, or are some of them just general open space, passive open space, or how is that viewed? I think it's kind of, with what's shown, a discussion point to be had, and I don't know if you wanna show, if you could, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
Area L was the other one, I think it was, to the west of Road H. Kind of an open space area behind the commercial properties along Main Street.
Yeah, here's open space L. I mean, you have sidewalk access, but there's nothing physically running through the open space.
Yeah. Whether or not something more needs to be added to that or not. To that point, there were, and the discussions were, to the far eastern corner, there was a trail added so that you can access the open space there.
And that's
Trail-
actually gonna be fully extended, not to interrupt you, that's gonna be fully extended so they can, physically walk to the coffee shop as well.
The other open space trail, kind of loops back up into the top. That was also eliminating what was kind of a mid-block crosswalk, if you would, and it went over to a driveway. That was requested to be addressed, and that was addressed. But really, as far as the access goes, was the other open space areas, and is there access provided to them? Should there be more than what's shown? It's kind of an interpretation of what the open space should be.
And in this regard, there's a lot of different issues involved here in open space, one of which is the 1 acre minimum. But to Scott's point about the open space appearing disjointed, I just want to refer everyone's attention to the definition of common open space in the ordinance, which is the standard definition. And it's areas of land or parcels of land within a PRD or a cluster development, that's not relevant here, designed and intended for the use and enjoyment of the residents of the PRD. So I think it's incumbent upon the applicant to explain forget about the 1 acre minimum for a moment, forget about the overlap of open space and stormwater management, although that certainly is implicated here. But in particular, some of these areas that are accessible only to specific units, how do those meet the requirement that they are designed and intended for the use and enjoyment of the residents of the PRD? Because frankly, to Scott's point, as he notes in the letter, just that first sentence, I think is spot on. It appears that the open space is secondary to the layout of the units and the street network. Essentially, we're looking at open space areas where you couldn't put houses anyway. So that's what's being called open space.
Well, again, due respect, we have a settled courtyard, we, make reference to, active recreational areas, certain places on the plan. We have, open space areas that are accessible by walking trail, sidewalk. So, I think the issue is that residents will be able to access each of the parcels without walking through somebody's backyard, to get to them, and in terms of, again, I don't believe that it's disjointed, but again, that's a matter of, personal opinion. Just also make note that given the, the interpretation, on the 628.13C1, relative to, ordinance 313, with respect to your, legal position, that we've submitted in a letter, then I copied you sort of in anticipation that we'd submit the letter. So we request a waiver on that part instead of arguing that. It's a legal interpretation, and to the extent that.
I'm sorry, Richard, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. I think I was finished.
Oh, sorry. I was just gonna say, so we have a difference of legal opinions there, or interpretations, not opinions. But, that's why there's an odd number of judges on courts. So I guess for the planning commission's benefit, if we just put aside that legal interpretation difference, if the planning commission wants to discuss the merits of a waiver from the 1 acre requirement, and then discuss the planning issues associated with the way the open space is laid out, because I don't think we want to ask the planning commission or bore anybody else in the room with our difference of legal interpretation.
No,
so why don't we talk about the planning issue and have the planning commission weigh in on the 1 acre issue and the way the open space is laid out.
I guess the concerns that I have, I see, the stage 1 active recreation area. That's great, but when I kind of look at that area, it's almost like those houses like indirectly own that area. I know other people in here are free to go there, but there's a fair number of homes in here, and does that one space address all their needs?
Well, there was a second, I understand your point, and I don't mean to interrupt, there was a second, I think it's on the second plan sheet, with an additional active rec area.
It's up top here, top left corner of the second sheet, the open space P. That's also to be constructed in stage 1.
But in terms of input, again, we made a reference following the board's, the commission's last meeting. Gary met with folks on the rec committee. I think, we're willing to contemplate either, some work in lieu, fee in lieu to help with making revisions to, township property, or, if there's something particular, again, these open spaces are designed for use of the residents of the, this particular community, not the township as a whole. But again, it made sense to do something different, given the township's proximity, if it's recreational field, baseball field, whatever, relative to this site, if it made sense to do something, and we'd submit, a waiver to address that, we'd be amenable to hearing that. But again, the layout's what the layout is.
To that point, and that was kind of a question I had, the intent for, the HOA agreement is for, and I guess overall, the question is the township and how it plays into, recreation areas. These recreation areas are strictly designed for and intended for the HOA.
Right, they'll be designed and insured by, maintained by the HOA.
Yeah, which goes along with the fact that they'd be expected to maintain, maintain, and, keep those. The discussion with the rec commission,
They didn't really have any suggestions on what we should put into this community for just this community. But they were receptive to the idea that, and maybe in lieu of some of these, areas, these little pocket areas that, it sounds like there's some concern, that we would take resources and apply them to a township park, and my understanding is there's something almost across the street where the baseball field is. They talked about a skate park or something. They didn't get into a lot of detail either, but they liked the fact that, that there could be some shared resources. And the way we left it was, somebody was gonna go talk to the supervisors to see what they thought about it, whether that discussion happened, or not. But I made it clear that we'd be willing to work something that would be more for the benefit of the entire, township, rather than just primarily for this community. So, to look at from the bigger picture, that may be a better way to go, but it's really kind of, y'all's call.
Yeah, I mean, the ball field in the other development, if we're gonna use that, that's fine, everybody's, it doesn't, I'm not aware of that, owning that, but I guess.
I think the township owns it.
Township owns it,
Yeah,
okay.
and that's why, for us to put resources, whether it's money or whether it's facilities, in that township park, then it's not just for Highcroft, or it's not just for Magnolia Green, it would be for the entire township. So they like that idea. I assume that their chairman was gonna have a discussion with the supervisors.
Okay,
So I
yeah,
guess-
I guess I just look at the development as a whole and say, all right, for the number of kids that'll be in there, is there adequate space for them to do kid stuff and not be out on the road, or, be somewhere else, cause there's nowhere else to go. And there are 2 spots, but, I question if that's enough, so.
Where are we
That's one.
percentage wise? If you look at it strictly from, percentage wise, you're proposing to meet the percentages, right, Justin?
So that was one of my questions. How is that percentage defined? So is that based on the physical surface area of a recreation improvement, or is it based on the area of the open space that contains that active rec area? Does that make sense? Is it based on like the field area and hard surface area of trails, or is it based on the open space areas that contain those features? Because those are 2 very different numbers.
I don't think I saw a specific designation for that active recreation area. I don't see that in there. I see that it calls for a certain percentage. I think that would probably just depend on what is considered the active recreation area. I know there's a loose interpretation of what that is. It gives examples, but not limited to. So, I think that's part of the how to determine how some of these they're met, because specifically to the 62810D, we're talking right now of the location and size of the common open space. It gets into some of the further details that are provided that, again, it's kind of, to be decided on whether or not it has to be an acre or not for each open space area, but that's some of the areas that are defined. When it comes to the active recreational area, I think there's a statement that says it needs to be, is that the 125 to?
That was to 25 to 35%.
35% of the open space area.
Sure.
So I think what defines that, it depends on what is going to be designated as the active recreational area. And I think that's kind of, to be honest, I think it'd be interpretive and agreed upon on what those limits are.
Yeah, so for example, this open space area here in total, so if this green area here is 1 acre, and this active rec box is 0.25 acres, am I able to take your credit for the 1 acre of the open space that contains that feature? Or is the area to be credited just the 0.25 acres for the active rec area only? That one's not quite as confusing as it is with the trails. Because, you know, say, for example, this is 1 acre. Am I able to take your credit for that entire area as 1 acre of active rec because you have a trails surface that's running through it? Because if I'm only credited for the paved surface, that's a small fraction of it, but the trail allows you to have access for the entire area.
I think it's a good question. Feel free to jump in, Michael.
I don't know that I want to interpret the ordinance on the fly, but having said that, I read, there's a requirement for common open space. So you start there, and then you start to talk about, okay, well, what does that common open space look like? How is it arranged? How is it organized? And then you get into not less than 25% or more than 35% of the minimum required open space shall be improved. So if you have, I'll just pull a number out of here, 10 acres of open space, then 2.5 to 3.5 acres of that area that is calculated as open space has to be active recreation space. So if you have a 1 acre, to use your example, if you have a 1 acre piece and 0.25 acres of that is active, then you have 0.75 acres that is not active. So you have an acre of open space and 0.25 acres of active recreation space there. But I don't know that you have to do it on a open space component by open space component. So if you have, again, 10 separate, again, I'm just pulling the number 10 out of here. If you have 10 separate open space areas throughout the development, you don't need to have 0.25 to 0.35 acres of each of those active recreation space. You can have one area that's devoted entirely to active recreation space and the others just be open.
So then no, if it's based on strictly the surface area of the recreation facilities, we don't meet that.
I
think that's what he's saying.
I don't know that I want to offer an interpretation, my interpretation of the ordinance on the fly, but that's, that first blush, that's how I read it.
Okay.
So I think we've covered 10.
I was gonna say, I think to define what you have as active recreational space and provide that percentage or the acreage or however you do it, but to have that on the plan and justify that, I think that's
Okay, yeah, we can do that.
ultimately the best thing to do there. And to your two examples, the active rec and the rectangle, I don't know if you can claim that whole acre as active rec, but in the area where you have a trail going through it, some of those areas.
Yeah, like that
depending
makes
on-
more sense to have
Some of
the
those
green
areas
area.
make sense as it's taking some of those areas, but others, I think it's hard to claim the other little pieces just because they're adjacent to, but I think there is, each one of them is gonna be a little bit more interpretive on that, but,
We'll give a rationale calculation.
yeah. So I guess,
So does the planning commission, does the planning commission want to discuss, whether it would support or whether it would recommend, modifications to allow for the layout as depicted on the plan? Does the planning commission want to reserve judgment on that until, it can consider the draft report that I suggested we would prepare? Or is the planning commission opposed to, modifications to allow the layout as depicted on the plan?
I would probably lean towards reserve until we get your thoughts on that in that letter. I mean, I guess for the plan as it stands, as far as the, you know, active recreation area. I think a great active recreation area is Zach St. Fields. I know that's huge, but it's an example of an area that you could do something with. And some of that exists in here. I'm just saying, I'd like to see more of it. I know that your plan, like, no matter how well you plan it, you're going to have spaces that are simply, I mean, they can't be used. It's just the nature of the shapes of the things that are going in there. But I guess I just kind of look at the density of the plan and have a concern that, you know, obviously kids are gonna live here, adults too, you know, is there a spot for them to do the things that they like to do? And I mean, you know, there's a spot, for Highcroft, that's the baseball field. It's not used for baseball, for games, but there are kids down there constantly, you know, playing like flag football, or, you know, kids and their parents doing stuff in there. And it's being used as it was intended to use. You know, the yards in those places aren't very big, so you can't really play catch out front. You need kind of a spot, you know, to do that. So that, I'm just trying to tell you where I'm coming from, so you understand, you know, clearly, like, when, you know, what I think, so.
Are you opposed to, or not opposed to, you know, some resources, adding to some of the resources?
I guess that doesn't help this area. I mean, if the kid has the ability to, you know, their parent's gonna take them somewhere to wherever that money goes or somewhere else. I guess I'm just thinking of it in the context of, you know, kids are in their neighborhood, they need something in their neighborhood to do, not, you know, have to.
I recall that Highcroft, in that basin, was also an area that was proposed to be used for baseball. Is that what you're talking about? Doesn't have backstop or anything, but I think I remember when that plan was approved, not only was the baseball field on the northwest side of Highcroft, also there was active rec that was considered to be used in that basin as well. Is that where you were talking about, where they play flag football?
No, I'm actually
you're
down
on
at
the
the
regular
field,
field.
like
Okay.
behind the fence or on there. Yeah, I don't know if that was an intent. I wasn't on this board, like, when they were, when that was proposed or when they were made. I guess for that neighborhood, it works. My home backs up to that, so, because that drains really well, and it's not often full. but not every area drains like that, you know, so.
So do we have kind of some direction? It sounds like we have
Yeah,
an
yeah,
understanding of
yeah,
what we're looking for.
yeah, we do, yeah.
I think if we're good on that one, then, moving on, number 11, I think Michael spoke to that one. It was really the, as it reads in the ordinance, it's the water supply, sanitary water, and storm water, and the feasibility of each. Basically, the comment is that they, I think as they've stated, that will be part of their future plans and layout, but as of right now, there's a water line provided throughout. Generally speaking, I don't think there's any hydrants. But for the sewer and water, there's no service will serve letters or capacity analysis or anything to provide that, so, unless there's anything to add to that from what we have shown or in the
We'll
comment.
get, if the concern is serviceability letters, with serviceability letters. You know,
No,
you all know what the capacity is. Water's looking for customers and the sewer plant's about 50%.
I mean, I think
But
to
we'll get
that
serviceability
comment,
letters.
really, in my opinion, on that comment, it speaks to the feasibility. And I think the plan, it is a concept plan and it shows generally what it shows for the layout, but as far as feasibility, it's just, there's really
So just,
nothing there for the utilities.
just to be clear, so for feasibility study or for feasibility to satisfy you, if we get, serviceability letters from sewer and water, stormwater, we're not gonna be able to give you a design by even the public hearing, but we have to comply with your stormwater ordinance. So if we don't comply with your stormwater ordinance, we're redesigning or losing units or something. That's, I mean, we have to meet,
Yeah.
we have to meet your stormwater ordinance.
And I agree with you there, I just, without any type of layout or general calculation for what's anticipated, it just, the circles for stormwater facilities, it's just a concept plan. I don't think it speaks to a feasibility. And I don't, without any type of study, as you're saying, I don't know how to speak to a feasible design without anything. I don't know, it is kind of what needs to be provided to show that, but I don't think there's anything
Well,
provided.
I think at the very least, we can calculate the volume of stormwater for each storm event that would need to be managed, at the very least. Now, does that constitute feasibility? I don't know that it does. Certainly, having the results of the infiltration testing would be helpful to determine feasibility, but as you pointed out earlier, that's not going to happen until after the first of the year, and obviously, again, absent an extension, those results are obviously not going to be available by the 10th. But it really does go to the planning commission's ability if these areas are not large enough to handle the volume that's required, or if they fail entirely, then we could be looking at potentially a wholesale revision of the plan, which would put us all right back here to do this all over again. So the ordinance requires feasibility, and the conclusion is that I don't think anybody's saying that no, what you're showing here won't work. I think what you're hearing is we don't know whether or not it will work.
So I guess at the risk of belaboring things, we're putting Justin on the spot. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you did like rough calculation about impervious area to come up with calculations for what stormwater would be, but there's no design about, so this basin in this area needs to be this big. And the infiltration is, you don't know exactly how the facilities get designed,
That's
whether you need
correct.
to amend
Yeah.
them. you know, whether you're gonna have good infiltration. So, again, I guess you know, the depiction is like a best guess based on, you know, perceived areas needed to handle presumed volumes, but, you know, whether that demonstrates feasibility versus an NPDS permit would surely demonstrate feasibility. I don't know, like,
No,
how close that gets, right?
I don't think anybody's looking for a full design at this point in time.
Can you make some assumptions on?
I
did already, I mean,
infiltration rates?
so, I do have some really rough pre versus post calcs that I did for peak rate only. I graded basins in, I routed them, and that's what these blue circles are based on, pretty much, you know, going around the entire embankment, and of course, you know, the cut slopes in the back. So I did some real rough calcs, I can send those to you, if that would help. I mean, it's not,
Honestly, I don't think there's any other way to approach it and say whether it's feasible or not. I mean, to the point of NPDS permit or not, since we don't have the standard, this is a PRD process, since we don't have the standard preliminary plan and the requirements that would say, here's what you do have to submit, we're left with the word feasible. And to
Well,
show those
will that do it?
lines.
What he suggested?
I think that leads towards being able to say, yes, I see that there are numbers and calculations. At this point, I haven't, without that, I can't say feasible in any way. I think that does speak to a lot of what Michael is requesting as well, but I think as shown, it is just, there's no way I can use the word feasible without any kind of, what you would have in a standard process, which would be preliminary numbers to show we're working towards the stormwater calculations. I think there is something.
You make a good point, and again, it wasn't done in a vacuum, but the work wasn't shown in terms of these are what we're anticipating for volume, and so these are the areas we're
Absolutely.
proposing.
And I think I think it goes to the same point of the sewer and the water. Is there any design areas that the sewer and water would have problems with just from taking a look at it? Is there a pump station of any sort needed that might throw a hurdle in it for you guys as well, on the design end of it? I think that's just a big picture review that, again, I don't know, without the authority having any feedback on will serve or capacity, how do you say it's feasible or not?
Again,
But-
I don't think we have any design about,
Yeah.
I think, right?
Well, you have manhole locations, you looked at that.
well, so we can show horizontal locations, but
And I don't know what
you know, the roads
discussions
have them
you've
in
had
profiles, we
or-
don't have vertical.
I don't know what discussions have been there with the authority or what level they would even ask to just give an opinion one way or another. But as far as the water and sewer, to the point of the section of the ordinance that's requiring that, is it feasible? Without any input from them, it's just, we don't have an answer on feasible or not.
I think we're clear on what.
That's my opinion of what the ordinance is looking for clarification.
Yeah, I mean, and just to put a finer point on this, looking at the ordinance, and I'm just gonna pull out, for example, section 598N, which talks about the community landscape design plan, which requires that the landscape plan be submitted at the time when all other required applications are submitted. That goes on to say, plans shall be based on and reflect the following objectives: a design which promotes effective management of stormwater to minimize soil erosion and sedimentation and creates opportunities for infiltration to the groundwater system. That's obviously hasn't been shown.
So what Justin explained, is that gonna be acceptable for you to review and determine feasibility?
And that's gonna be for just peak rates, I'm not gonna do groundwater recharge, water quality. It's only sizing basins to more or less comply with the peak rate requirements for now.
From what he's saying, that sounds like it's a justification for what is shown on the plans. And it's not gonna be a final design, but it's definitely providing information to justify that it's feasible.
So that's a yes to my question.
I think that's, I haven't, Again, as Michael was saying, without seeing anything, it's hard to say yes or no. I
Sure.
mean, there's gotta be something to look at before we can say yes.
So again, we.
That
we
does
have
sound
what we
like-
had. We
Yeah.
can get that to you. To be candid, I think our thought was that's preliminary. We're saying, look, we obviously need to comply with the ordinance and state law. So, we'll do that, and didn't think to show you sort of the preliminary work. If that helps, it helps. If it, we have it, so.
The hesitation isn't to jump out there and say yes or no and just get captured on, well, you said yes.
Right.
But it is a matter of, we do still have to review it, but it's definitely a lot more in working towards being able to provide an opinion. Yeah. And it sounds like from what he's saying, that does answer the question of
So
what are
it's
those,
maybe.
what are those blue
So it's a
lines?
maybe. Let's think
What
of
about
maybe.
the possibility of incorporating underground detention?
That's a
Does
possibility.
that help also with your open space requirement? Cause you wanna have a base.
Actually,
It's not going to based on what
actually,
Michael said before.
it probably will. We may as well jump to that comment now, since you raise it. And Scott, I think that's comment number 25 on your letter.
I'll follow your lead.
So that Commonwealth Court decision that I referred to earlier, let me just grab it here. So, there's nothing new under the sun, and in 2021, the Commonwealth Court considered the question of, in a PRD context, quote, referencing an earlier decision from 2011, the Commonwealth Court wrote, "We considered whether a proposed PRD that attempted to include stormwater management areas in its common open space satisfied a township's requirements where the township's definition of common open space, like the zoning ordinance here, excluded, quote, public facilities from the calculation of common open space." And the Commonwealth Court, both in the 2011 decision that's referenced here and in this decision, determined that public facilities, stormwater management facilities are public facilities, and they are to be excluded from the calculation of open space. The applicant here suggests, well, we have underground basins, so can't we include those in the calculation of open space? And I thought about that, and I took a look at the definition of detention basin and retention basin in the Saldo, and those definitions do not make a distinction between above ground or below ground systems. So I think as a matter of law, the areas devoted to stormwater management should be excluded from the common open space calculation. That's my legal interpretation. Now, whether or not the planning commission wants to entertain a request for a modification so that those areas could be included within the open space, that's a different question. And we can talk about that. But I think as a matter of law, those areas are excluded from common open space.
And if I could
I
just,
think we're fine
to
either way.
keep
We're
stuff,
fine either way.
so again, I don't know, just, I'll need to take another look at that, at that case, but here, the ordinance specifically allows you to include 25%, so I don't know if the context was different there, that you weren't specifically allowed to include it, and they were trying to include it anyway, saying that it could be, utilized both to stormwater or not. Again, we'll go through that, and if the township's essentially saying that its ordinance is invalid because you can't have 25% sorted.
I'm sorry, let me just jump in. I think that this ordinance allows for up to 25% of open space to also be stormwater management areas.
Right.
My comment and my reference to Gowans, the Commonwealth Court decision, is to the extent that you are claiming anything over the 25% threshold, I don't think that that's properly countable as common open space as a matter of law under the Carnarvon Township ordinance.
Okay, so again, I don't want to belabor that point, but I think what Justin's saying too is that we probably don't need to contemplate utilizing underground storage, but again, the idea that, you don't park cars in a stormwater basin, but you put stormwater facilities under a parking lot, you have two uses, it costs a heck of a lot more, but again, But that's something we'll just parse through. If we think we need it, if we don't need it, we'll look at alternatives.
I think we do, I think we'll be, we'll be all right.
Okay, well, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to think it was out of order, but since the question was raised, I figured we may as well address it there.
Just in the interest of keeping us moving, right? We're on
So-
411, you made a point about, you know, from your perspective, lack of demonstration of feasibility. We think we can get some additional information that we have that didn't think it was needed, but to the extent it might be helpful, we'll provide what we have, and you can conclude what you will when you see it.
And I agree, it will be helpful.
Okay. So are we up to 12?
Yeah, no, I think number 12, to jump right into that one, it speaks to what was provided by the Turnpike. The question is, the old alignment is still kind of shown as a background area, just denoted. Is it appropriate to show that realignment of the Turnpike on there? Is there drawings provided that are sufficient enough to show that on the drawings? And just the question speaks to, does it impact the density and open space areas?
Wasn't that area shown, Gary, to accommodate the initial relocation of Willow Run?
Yeah, Eric's been in conversation with them to try and confirm what their final design's gonna look like. Cause there's been a couple of changes, so. Will it impact, you know, there's also some area that, I think would kind of come our way when, the Willow's Glen area to the west of that goes away, so it may be a wash, but we don't know exactly what their layout is, but Eric's working on it. Eric has been trying to reach him, get an answer for the last couple of weeks, and he sent something out again today.
So I may be able to serve as a conduit there. We represent the Turnpike. So Eric, is Eric there?
It was Eric Mounts, Eric's not here.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, so I may be able to, if he's not having luck contacting somebody at the Turnpike, I may be able to plug him into the right person to the extent that's necessary.
Thank you. Well, I'll forward you the contact information tomorrow for Eric
Okay.
Mounts. I mean, he submitted reports in his traffic plan and design.
Yeah, I was looking for my phone to see who he's been in contact with, but, yeah, we'll let you know.
Okay, happy to help.
Okay, appreciate that.
So that was a comment there. Comment number 13 was speaking to the parking along the roadways. I think we've discussed that. I think that this comment also spoke to the fact that the intent is during snow emergencies, cars that have to leave the roadway, if they can't provide the parking on their property, then it's, I believe, mandated that the commercial properties are.
It will be in their documents, it will be in the commercial documents that the snow emergency parking will be allowed in parking lots.
Yeah, and that's really a statement there, unless anybody has any comments to add to it. 14, that speaks to, which I think you just, Chip handed out, was anything that documented a modification or waiver. The request was either have it in writing or show it on the plans, and that's what this is.
Correct.
I don't know if you're able to keep track of if there's any that we missed or had on here that.
And that's on us, so I'm on page 4.
Okay, we'll just keep moving then. Number 15. Didn't really have any comment on. This really kind of speaks to what we've already talked about as far as, is there the ability for the it kind of talks to a lot of what we've already spoke about, but, this overlaps with another comment in here, that currently the recreational areas as identified, and now we were taking just the 2 areas that were identified as open recreation. I don't think we took into consideration the trail as a number. Again,
Okay.
I think it's better to have that recreation area called out as a number on the plans, to
Okay.
be able to specify and be able to identify whether or not that has been met.
Yeah, sure.
I'll reach out to the Park and Rec chair to see if they had any discussion with supervisors as far as what direction they wanna go, or if they don't wanna do anything offsite, to give us some ideas of what we should install.
I don't know if the planning commission has any comments on that end of it or not, the active recreation areas, and whether you would provide a recommendation for what that should be, or just encourage the discussion with the rec board, or if you wanna add anything at this point, or just move on from that comment.
I would say just deal with the rec board and supervisors more. So more for township use than just HOA.
Then moving on, the next section, number 16, speaks to, the township impact evaluation. There was specific requirements for that. I don't know if you had received all of the comment letters from them, if there's anything there that needs to be discussed. I think, if there isn't anything specific, I guess the one comment, and I would expect it to probably be a comment from the supervisors as well, and I know it's something you're familiar with, Gary, but the road foreman's comment of possibly providing some type of easement or future access, if feasible in any way, to connect to Clymer Hill Road, because of the continued conversation of how does that connect up to that roadway. Really, that was just a comment that I think does reflect something that they've talked about for years, but I think it's a relevant comment for this area and slowly moving up towards that.
There has been some discussions, but, I'm not gonna share them in this meeting because of the legal nature. It's a good thing, but it's just in preliminary discussions, so.
I don't know if you've each had a chance to review those letters that fire marshal, chief, road foreman, and the police chief had commented on it. If you don't have any specific comments on them.
Well, I agree, it'd be nice to connect with that.
Yeah. I think the fire, I think before we're done, I think the fire marshal had some comments that were probably worth just touching on, but,
Are you talking about you talking about the chief's letter, or are you talking about the Technicon letter?
I think the chief's letter
Pretty
just said
simple.
we
Can't look at anything because there's no fire hydrants, and
yeah.
he wants fire hydrants every 600 feet, which I believe we can accommodate. We'll incorporate that into the design. I think we looked at truck turning. I know we did on a commercial. Actually, the turning that Eric used was a little bigger than the fire truck that the chief said we should use.
Yeah. That's the fire marshal that was making those comments. But he commented on what the fire chief usually recommends, so. I think to that point, I think it's.
The townhomes will be sprinkled, those sprinklers, probably the commercial was sprinklers. But until he sees the commercial, he's.
Yeah, I would say my comment, or I think the comment that was provided by the fire marshal that probably, as I said, would be worth discussing is the turning movement, and I think there was a concern of where and how it would access and maneuver around each one of the commercial sites. I think the roadway itself, I think there's some other future comments coming up about the,
Which one, what do you have up there?
This is still the old one. I have the new one in the back if you wanted to show that too.
Yeah,
I was gonna say just,
We can provide that.
yeah,
I think there's other comments in here, I think it's better.
based on his comment and some of our internal discussions, we can address that comment by the way we're gonna change some of the roads. Or not roads, but the access in the commercial area.
Okay. I don't necessarily know if there's any active bus routes that had the comment.
So Mary, can I just jump back there for my notes? So you, I'm sorry, did you say you have the truck turning exhibits run? You did those already?
Those done by Eric, we have
Yeah,
truck turning, but not for the fire truck. Just for your standard,
Okay.
would be 64.
Yeah, the commercial he ran,
Okay.
the changes that we wanna make to the commercial, he ran fire truck.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
I don't think comment number C, I think we discussed as far as stormwater is concerned, I think this comment as well as any moving on, there is gonna be an NPDS permit required, obviously, and they've stated that. I think the additional information they're talking about providing will help speak to the feasibility, which I think any stormwater comment herein is really speaking to providing that information, so I don't know if we have to really touch on those anymore. I think they more or less addressed the issue, or the comments that were made about open space being dedicated or, the generated taxes there. E, the education section of the narrative, there was information provided, I don't know if you had a chance to review that, stating that the Twin Valley School District buildings are underutilized by roughly 30.5%. There was question on the building capacity, it showed that, I guess just for clarification, how's that?
It was derived based on a feasibility study by the architect. And that's pretty current, it's definitely within the last year.
Okay, I think that was just kind of a review comment on looking at that and trying to get that clarified and. I think that information would be helpful just to see it if it's possible.
So what are you looking for, what the architect's feasibility, or what their feasibility study was based on? They went through each building, they looked at each space, and they determined what was available and what the capacity was. Is that what you're looking for?
Yeah, I think it was just a question of, they kind of made the statement that there's,
get that from.
here's capacity, but it wasn't really reproducible on our end to figure out how you got it. I don't know if there's any other questions on that, on those comments in there. Number 17, I know there was an acknowledgement that we agreed didn't need more than an acknowledgement. Comment 18 spoke to the access to the ILP parcel, just as we were talking. Can you clarify when I was reviewing this, I was looking at that lane coming off of Main Street as well as off the main road coming in. I thought that was going to be the main access for these parcels. Is that correct, or did you say they're only for delivery vehicles?
That was the intent on this plan, to be the main access with driveways coming off the back to serve each lot. But we've since taken a second look at that, but that was the intent initially.
PennDOT, since this was submitted, PennDOT has, they said that they'll allow a right in, left in, an entrance only into the commercial area. Because there's already a center lane that it's not gonna allow an exit, but it'll allow an entrance.
And that's what's on that's what's shown?
No, this is gonna go away. We can't do that. That's not gonna work. That's showing full access. PennDOT's saying that somewhere down in here, we can have a right in, left in.
What is that loud? It's like 2, 3, somewhere in there.
So there's an existing utility pole between lots 3 and 4, it's gonna be just east of that to miss the utility.
It's gonna miss the pole and it's gonna miss the pipe that goes across. PennDOT will allow that.
Okay.
So that would come in and then split to both the left and the right to provide access to each of the lots.
So that would provide an access lane to come up however far is sufficient to allow for.
Up to the front of the building.
Yeah, for
Stacking.
for an appropriate, stacking and building size. Yeah, so there would be a drive here in front of the buildings, and then this one essentially stays to provide an access for loading behind the building.
And then did the other access points onto the road A, road B remain?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
very close to what's shown there.
Okay. And then there were other comments about those in there, but that's, okay, then. Okay, so that would be revised, so that's gonna be revised and shown as that access point?
Correct.
That's, okay.
So what is your intention in terms of timing for revising the plans and showing them?
That may be submitted for the hearing.
Okay, so that's not something that the planning commission will have the opportunity to review and comment on?
No, I guess that's a fair statement. Again, we're probably gonna make revisions based on the comments that we got with this review letter, just to keep working toward a cleaner plan, which is what we see the process is supposed to be. And again, we talked about it. I mean, if it made a difference, we could get it ahead of time, but that's, you end up reviewing it for the hearing.
We can probably get that revised, commercial area that we just talked about out next week. Early next week, beginning next week. If you guys wanna see what we're talking about.
Well, I'm just cognizant of the fact that the planning commission is supposed to issue a report. And to my mind, that means that the plan that the planning commission is commenting upon and reporting on is the plan that the board is gonna conduct a hearing on. And I'm not trying to nitpick, I just want to make sure that
Due respect, I think that.
we're not commenting on something that is not going to be before the board.
Well, yeah, I guess that's your choice on how you handle it. I mean, from our perspective, writing a recommendation based on the plan that was submitted, the review letter that Scott had an opportunity to prepare, the legal, analysis you've given, that's fair. But again, to think that, that we're not gonna sort of tweak our plan based on comments. I mean, what we got was comments from the fire marshal, the police, the roadmaster, county planning, to think that we're not gonna make revisions to the plan to try to incorporate information that's responsive to the comments we got. That's just how this process is, so.
Yeah, I hear you, and I'm not arguing with you. I just, access and access is one of the things that the ordinance expressly calls out as being something that has to be shown and the planning commission is supposed to comment on, so. But okay, well, I think we understand each other. Let's move on.
I guess, yeah, it's kind of a curveball, just to the point that the recommendation for what you're looking at, and if, I guess, are we providing a report in comments based on the plans that are in front of the planning commission, and assuming that that report will be provided before January 10th, Michael, and I only say that just because the comments discussed tonight, if they have to put together a report, an opinion, I guess they may be delaying that, but some of the
Yeah,
comments
my sense is that, again, in the absence of an extension being granted by the applicant, the board has to hold the hearing on January 10th. And though it's possible that that hearing may go on for more than one night, we can't be assured of that. So, to my mind, the planning commission has to issue its report under the assumption that the hearing is going forward on the 10th, and that that hearing will begin and end on the 10th. It might not. I don't think we want to assume that it won't. So, I think we're in the position that I referred to earlier, and that is, after tonight, we will work on a draft recommendation report, and then the planning commission, if the members are able and willing, would hold a special meeting to ratify and adopt that report as the report of the planning commission, and we would forward that to the board. That's the process that I see going forward, given the fact that we are operating under the constraint of having the hearing on the 10th.
Yeah, and I think that my concern is right now the comment based on the plan, the layout, and really with the IOP commercial lots. I mean, they show this accessible lane, which now I'm told isn't really the accessible lane for people that are gonna be accessing and frequenting those lots, that the detail, it doesn't meet the requirements of section 603 of the zoning ordinance, which is to demonstrate safe, convenient access for servicing, fire protection, and off-street parking. There's no demonstration of that. And as we move forward, if that plan changes, our discussion is based upon the fact that it isn't, and whether you would provide a recommendation or how you would provide that. And again, I think that's yes, you can choose not to add the extension, but if you do provide an extension, it provides a chance for a revised plan to get in front of the planning commission possibly, and for you to see that plan and maybe change your opinion of what's recommended. And in the end, the recommendation may not be the same plan that they're gonna look at, so, it's a little convoluted on our end on how to approach that and provide a recommendation, but I think as it's shown, the comment number 18 was really speaking to, there was a lack of detail for providing that. Some of the discussion of the pedestrian access across Road A plays into, this same comment on whether or not it provides a safe access point without those crossings interior, or what occurs with access to these properties. I'm not sure. I just don't feel that it's compliant. I guess we touched on that. Some of the other comments were per the PennDOT comments, and again, I'm looking at what's shown on the plan, and PennDOT was saying that they wouldn't entertain any type of limited access for turns to come out and say, take a right on the main street. There's just not enough motorists obeying the traffic laws when it comes to that, and the only thing they'll entertain is a right entering entrance at the front of these. They won't allow cars to come back out on the main street at that location. They push them to the lights. As shown, and with the changes to the bridge, it just seems that once that bridge changes, would that access still work? We're being told it's probably gonna move anyway, but there was some current concerns there on that, in that, whether or not it's feasible. Yeah, so I still think that's kind of a concern as it's shown. 19 was addressed. Number 20, And I kinda got ahead of myself. This speaks to 608.4 and the access to a commercial lot. One of the things it's supposed to demonstrate is, there's no, conflicts with pedestrian traffic. It's safe for the pedestrian traffic. It really doesn't offer that in the design. And the other concern, I don't think the zoning ordinance specifically states that they have to have access onto a public street. It somewhat implies that, but I don't think it explicitly calls out for that. But since there's commercial lots that won't have their own individual access, there's gonna have to be an access agreement across all the properties, agreed upon by all commercial properties, that that access will not be, denied to their business. And, I would defer any other language and comments to the solicitor on that, but as shown, that would be needed for each one of those lots. Again, number 21 speaks to loading and parking requirements. Each one of these commercial lots is part of what's shown here, and ultimately, I think this kind of speaks to one of the concerns I have with the commercial lots. This is really a subdivision, and they're gonna be individually owned. As part of that subdivision, it shows setbacks, it shows an access lane, but it just doesn't demonstrate a lot of the other requirements. In this case specifically for parking, it doesn't demonstrate that it has the loading requirements, and it doesn't have parking requirements.
It's kind of difficult because we don't know what we don't know if it's, you know, we're showing like 1 acre lots,
Yeah.
but we could end up with a user that wants 3 acre lots, and it might require 2 loadings, and it might require more parking or less parking. It's really hard, to put that there with where we are at the tentative plan stage.
Yeah, and I think that
We're
speaks
obviously gonna
to,
need it by final plan.
and to that point though, and it's how you wanna proceed with that. I think the PRD, the other concern is if you have individual lots and say you wanted to combine those, and then your access drives and parking changes, the PRD basically spells out that any variation may lend itself to another public hearing. And again, that's just part of the process that we're dealing with here. I think it's 628(7) or something like that. But I think that's without the definition of each one of those commercial lots. That's just, I don't think there's anything that moving forward with these zoning requirements, it doesn't show that, but if they want to move forward with the lots as they're shown, they comply with the yards and setback requirements.
So you're saying that if that changes, what, we just can't, that can't be dealt with through the building application?
So it's, I don't see how that's the way it's processed in the PRD. And that's
For what it's worth, Scott, you referenced it in your letter, and I agree with your analysis. Basically, if you have a tentative plan design approved and you make changes in your final plan, you have to approve the tentative plan, the supervisors in reviewing the final plan can require additional public hearing relative to that change information. So again,
and it can be, it doesn't necessarily say it has to, but it is it's again, dealing with the PRD, it's a different set of rules, and it's a little bit interpretive, but the 628(7)D, in the event the development plan, and this speaks to the final plan, as submitted, contains variations from the development plan given tentative approval, the governing body may refuse to grant final approval and shall, within 45 days from the filing of the application for final approval, so advise the landowner in writing of said refusal, setting forth in said notice reasons why and more. In the event of such refusal, the landowner may either refile, and then it speaks to the process there. but
But
that's,
for what it's worth, we went from, here's a 6-acre IOP, we're proposing commercial uses to, well, can you show us how this could be laid out as a concept plan? And I understand, and then whether that gave all the detail about how that, if you have again, we didn't identify what type of use, so figuring out what the required parking and all that, but, whether it's a sit-down restaurant versus something else. So again, I get your comment.
I think to the point that you're saying there, I think access needs to be identified. You're showing the yard requirements for this. I think those other, specifics on what happens to each one individually does fall into the process of what the PRD. But as far as a tentative plan approval, as long as you're meeting the, and Michael, I think this is what you said, access, yard setbacks, densities, that kind of thing for the zoning, I think that's what we're looking for.
I think from an area and bulk perspective, just showing a box that meets the area and bulk, I'm sorry, that meets the area and bulk criteria, excuse me, is sufficient. The calculations to show that each of the lots will comply from an impervious perspective, showing access. The PRD regs do require that all other applicable zoning requirements be met. So, I don't expect that you should lay out your parking fields for each of these uses at this point in time. But certainly I think it's important to know that there's enough space on each individual lot for the parking that would be required, say for instance, for a 7,500 square foot sit-down restaurant. It's a simple calculation to do how many parking spaces would be required for that. But again, I don't know that you need to show the level of detail that would be required for a conditional use. Well, you don't need to show that level of detail. But this just comes back to the initial comment of whether or not there's sufficient detail shown to A, allow the planning commission to make a recommendation, and B, allow the board to ultimately make a decision. And that'll be up to the board, of course. I guess what we're hearing is that we just don't know, or you just don't know enough information to be able to allow you to develop the plans to the extent that at least I think would be necessary. But that's essentially asking the planning commission to make a recommendation in a vacuum.
To build off of that, I think the question is, say, parking, loading zones, which is the comment we're on, they will need to demonstrate that. I think that's, if they're saying within the space that they provide, they can. These are hypothetical uses they're throwing on there. They may be very much more limited to what they can do on each one of those lots. I don't necessarily know that the parking and loading zone must be demonstrated on the tentative plan, but it's just making the comment that it isn't demonstrated at this point. To keep going down through here, because I think there's a couple of those. Number 22 speaks to some of the screenings that would be required along the areas. I don't think that's necessarily a point to kind of labor on here. The 23 is the same thing. It's more or less a landscaping requirement that would not hold up any kind of a decision for the tentative plan. Number 24 speaks to the active recreational, but I think we had a conversation about that in depth, that there's going to be some more information provided to specify some of those numbers. I guess to that point, the plan that we're looking at now, the areas identified as active recreation is 16% for what the numbers were. The recreation paths could be considered, but there's not really a number on the plan that I think is shown to be able to throw those into a percentage. So right now it's just less than 25% minimum.
We can give you more detail on that, Scott.
Yeah, it sounds like there will be some provided. Number 25 is, we talked about that one in depth. That was the open space to the stormwater management facilities. I think we have the direction on where that's going. 26, 27 are not discussion points. 28, that speaks to the HOA documents that are needed eventually. 29 speaks to the parking, but I think we already talked on that one, on parking that will be on the roadways. Comment 30, we also talked about the open space management plan. I do want to clarify, the comment I had said shall be submitted with the application for final. What Michael was pointing out is that the actual requirement in the ordinance says it should be submitted with a land development plan or with a PRD application. So the comment I had in there didn't capture that with the PRD application. Comment 31 is just more landscaping screening requirements that would not need to be addressed at this time. Again, comment number 32 speaks to screenings that, although they were commented on, they didn't get added to the plans in those areas, but have been acknowledged to say that they will be. Number 33 was just a clarification comment that they provided. Number 34, that spoke to the number of trees that were required. The comment said that stationing was added to help provide. It didn't change the calculation of the trees, but we're still of the opinion that there was gonna be another possible 63 trees that should have been added in that calculation.
We'll double check that,
Yeah,
Scott.
I think that's just more of an acknowledge that if it's needed, it will be needed. Moving on to number 36. This we kind of spoke on, that there are currently the requirement of 628(5)(b) is that the plan demonstrates compliant yard densities and other zoning requirements, specifically the IOP commercial. We were basically stating that there was some of those requirements that can't be verified as compliant on the current plan. I think we spoke about some of the open space and the other requirements for that, but there's other zoning requirements that just weren't provided to be verified. I don't necessarily know that they have to be, but it was just a specification. 37, again, I think we're kind of touching on we kind of covered a lot of these comments. This again spoke to the active recreational areas. Number 38, this was a comment that, as per the decision of the board for a tentative plan approval, would need to speak to the plan demonstrating that the traffic will be not a negative impact to the community. Again, I think we've had feedback from PennDOT, but I don't think there's necessarily any kind of a traffic study that provides a justification for impacts. That's my opinion there, that we didn't provide anything other than the meeting with PennDOT and what their expectations are, but there hasn't really been traffic data submitted.
And along those lines, I'll just point out, Township's ordinance number 174 from 2000, which is on the Township website. You just bear with me a second here. Let's get back to that for a second. Requires a traffic impact study for any application. Certainly one that has the characteristics that we're talking about here. So whether to comply with that ordinance or to allow the board ultimately to make the findings that it would have to make one way or the other on the application. Again, I don't mean this to sound pejorative, but the planning commission and the board are going to be operating in a vacuum in the absence of that information. Yeah, I don't mean to say that in a negative way. I just to emphasize the point that we're not dealing with a lot of information here.
So when would that traffic impact study be done? It's not gonna be done at this stage. I mean, the PennDOT has to confirm what the traffic study's gonna be, which is what they're working on.
Agreed. I understand the question. I think the question I would kind of throw back then, and I'm just trying to speak to what the ordinance says here when I'm looking for this, but basically the decision on a tentative plan is to demonstrate that the physical design of the development plan and the manner in which the said design does or does not make adequate provisions to provide adequate control over vehicular traffic, and to make that decision and make that call. I don't know how you do
I
that.
guess, I think we had this, it's a little bit of deja vu, because I know we had this conversation at the, at the first meeting, and, from our perspective, we say we're gonna demonstrate compliance by having an approved traffic impact study and implementing whatever those requirements are. I think I remember Michael making the comment, well, but, you could do that ahead of time, and then you could come in with that approval, and our perspective is, but, we base it on what we're proposing, but then maybe that's not ultimately what gets approved, so we need to do a new traffic impact study anyway. So to me, it's a little bit of
Understood.
I understand you're saying the information you have does not demonstrate that there won't be a traffic problem. The alternative would be, a condition to comply with ordinance number, 174, and perform a traffic study, obtain the required PennDOT HOP approvals, will demonstrate that there won't be a problem with traffic, that the plan as it is to be designed will be feasible. So I guess we're not gonna give you.
But Chip, you know as well as I do that promising to comply is not the same as demonstrating compliance at the time of the hearing. And in this instance, as Scott just pointed out, the ordinance expressly requires the applicant to provide information to allow the board to make a determination about the impact of the development on the road system.
But again,
So
our
in the
perspective is
absence
that
of-
this tentative plan is not the same thing as a preliminary plan, maybe more analogous to a sketch plan. And again, to the extent that we identify the process that we're working through with the scoping study and that, and providing all that analysis and then ultimately permit approval, that's not a promise to comply, that's a requirement that we go through a process. It's not a process that we have to do in order to be allowed to move through this process. So it's just, to me, again, I'm not gonna convince you, but that's my response to the analysis.
Actually, you might, but maybe you can convince me with the answer to this question. How can the planning commission make a recommendation and the board ultimately make a decision about the impacts of the development on the road system in the absence of more information? And maybe it's not a full traffic impact study, but in the absence of more information than what the applicant has provided thus far, how can the planning commission possibly make that recommendation and the board possibly make that determination? Other than by saying, we're going to impose a condition that says that you have to do a TIS.
Well, what's the risk of moving forward if we ultimately can't get highway occupancy permit? Because it costs too much money to put in whatever required improvements might be needed as a condition of that permit. Again, to me, there is a process that we need to work through. I just don't think we need to work through that process to be where we are now, respectfully.
And I may not disagree with that. I'm just cognizant of the obligation of the board to, if it grants approval, to write a decision that justifies that grant of approval and say, this is the information that we relied upon in order to make this finding regarding the impact of the development on the road system. Or if the board is inclined to deny the application, they need to say, we denied it because we didn't have this information and we couldn't make this finding about the impact on the road system. I suppose at the end of the day, that's whether the planning commission feels as though it has enough information for a recommendation is one question. Whether the board feels it has enough information to be able to make that ultimate decision and justify that decision in its findings is another question. And I suppose whether or not there is sufficient information provided is, it's ultimately your evidentiary burden to carry before the board. So I don't think what you're hearing from us is that, we're trying to be sticklers here or throw sand in the works. We're trying to say, we see an issue here and I suppose at the end of the day, it's up to you whether you want to go to the board with information that allows the board to make that decision, or go to the board and say, just impose a condition that we'll do a TIS later.
Right.
That's it.
You're right.
Didn't Eric provide you with counts based on?
It provided generation from
Church generation.
everything within the footprint of the site. So impacts to what's an already possibly congested roadway, just hypothetically speaking, you don't have any of that information. Obviously, everything's gonna be handled by whatever's just coming out of the
And
site.
that's driven by PennDOT.
It's driven by the roadway network and that stuff. And I think to that point on my end of trying to provide a recommendation or lead someone in the direction of, is it feasible? Again, just like we were looking at with the stormwater, is what's provided in the PRD at this stage. And if the answer is no data, I don't know what that answer is, because typically if this would have been a preliminary plan, you're provided with, if nothing else, a first run through of stormwater or traffic and that, and is that required moving forward to say it is feasible on that? Preliminary plans, you don't need approvals like we were kind of talking about before, but you have the idea of what the feedback is and where that is. At this point, we have the direction of what a study should include, but
It's interesting that, depends on which side of the situation you're on. Obviously, if we thought traffic was gonna be, an insurmountable obstacle, you wouldn't start the process.
Yeah.
If we thought there was gonna be a problem with sewer, stormwater, or anything else, you know what I mean? So,
And-
again, there's some level of comfort, but again, you don't have all the considerations that went into it.
And
So
I
I get it.
think it, to that point, I think it plays to the location of the access drive that comes into Road B between Road A and Main Street. Is that even feasible? Is that gonna be permitted? And if not, where does that go? And then you start running into, well, do you have to go back in for that second hearing? Because it's the PRD process. I don't, some of those are a concern on my end, but I'm not on the other end of it, so it may not be a concern moving forward that it would that much big of a change, but.
At the end of the day, I think what I just said is an appropriate comment, if I do say so myself. And that is, it's the applicant's evidentiary burden at the hearing to demonstrate compliance and to give the board enough information to allow the board to approve the plan and write a decision that justifies that approval. All we can do is raise the issues and say, we don't think that has been submitted. If the planning commission agrees with us as their consultants, then they'll issue a recommendation that says as such. If the board agrees with us, then they'll take whatever action that leads to. If the board thinks, hey, we do think there's enough information here, and they can write a decision that justifies that, then that'll be what the board does. But again, I don't mean to sound flippant, but it is the applicant's burden, and if the applicant feels as though they've satisfied that burden, it's not for us to convince them otherwise,
And I think,
with all due respect.
put it back to the comment and maybe just keep moving here, is I think my comment specific to that, I try to stay objective to what's being requested in the ordinance. And that, like I said, spoke to adequate control over vehicular traffic. My opinion was it just didn't demonstrate that it was adequate, only because there wasn't the information provided. Again, to Gary's point, that will be provided in the traffic impact study when that's produced. But that's just not here yet. I think comment 39 speaks to the open space and recreation facilities, which we spoke about. I think there's gonna be revisions too. Comment 40 just speaks to the fact that there are modifications requested. To approve the plan, you would need to recommend an approval of the plan. It would have to include those modifications. Comment number 41 really just stated the variation of a plan may require a hearing later on in the final plan process. It doesn't necessitate any kind of response or anything. Subdivision, there were comments here that I don't necessarily know if we need to focus on them unless somebody reads one of them and wants to, but, comment 1 spoke to, agreements that'll be needed that need to be entered into later on in the process. Comment 2 speaks to the, DEP requirements that'll be covered once there's a conservation district review for the permitting. Comment 3, I think that's just agreement and procedural. Comment 4, again, that's the water authority, sewer authority, I'm sorry, we need to be reviewing. Comment 5, just acknowledged. Comment 6, addressed. Comment 7 speaks to that the street grades will need to be complied with. That's acknowledged. I think that's reasonable for that comment. Comment 6 spoke to roadways that change by a certain deflection amount. They need to provide a straightened away area or a curve of a certain requirement there.
Could you, so,
in that case,
just being cautious, this comment letter requests a waiver
Sure.
from that provision, but I really we weren't sure whether you were talking about, like,
Road width, or what is that? Which roads does that apply to?
so
if we keep the center
502,
line.
that really spoke to, if you have a roadway, like,
Where you make this connection up here.
hold on, I gotta go here. C and D, there's a bend in the roadway. If that's a certain deflection,
This, so it makes a little
Wow.
dot right there. Okay.
I think it's avoiding roadways that may bend without a proper amount of sight distance.
C, D, and E do. Is there any tolerance with that? Cause that's,
There is.
cause
I
that's a
just-
super small angle.
5028. It is 5 degrees.
Okay.
So it is specified, it's just not specified on the plan to know whether or not it complies or not. It could comply and it doesn't need a waiver, but I can't help.
Well, then again, we were thinking maybe that was where there were connections to existing roadways that, we keep the center line, but the road width narrows. That's not what you were talking about.
No.
Okay.
No, that was just, and there are a couple comments on here as far as the salvo comments. I think there's a few waivers we're gonna get into that speak to what's shown on the plans, and if it stays as is, it's gonna need a waiver.
So we'll say a waiver, but then we'll also, Justin will calculate whether that's 5 degrees or less or more.
Yeah, that'll take a couple minutes, so we can confirm that pretty quickly.
Yeah. Intersections, road B and H with Main Street, we spoke about this one. So this speaks to the main entrance across from Crossing Drive, as well as the entrance further down to the east, which is coming closer to the coffee shop there, I'm gonna say. that area there, the separation on a main street like that is supposed to be 1,000 feet, per the ordinance. Really, that intersection and those controls are, going to be reviewed by PennDOT and whether or not they meet those requirements. In my opinion on this, although it is a township requirement, I'm not saying it should be deferred to PennDOT, but I think they will have some input that may drive whether or not that's an acceptable separation, but, really, according to the ordinance, it does not meet that requirement and would require a waiver since it's only 750 feet of separation.
Yeah, I think you were on the ball, I mean, they were okay with that.
They did not push back on the separation of those two streets, so yes, that's what it kinda, I think that's almost in the situation where you require a curve along the roadway, but if it's a PennDOT road, you kind of defer to whether or not if they want it or not. They kind of say no sometimes, Main Street's one of them. But, so that's number 9. 10, this spoke to, sight distance at intersections. I think, really just to kind of get into this, there may be some landscaping that needs to be revised to provide clear sight lines, but, clear sight triangles, I think that might be adjusted, and simply moving them would adjust that. I would say that the other thing I added on here is the cluster mailboxes are very close to the intersections, and I think you can probably put up no parking signs and hope that helps, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's gonna create an area. I think that could be an area that should be considered on maybe can you move them back or put them somewhere that it wouldn't cause issues. I think we can guarantee that everybody's gonna be parking their car and getting out and getting their mail. With only 5 of those, everybody gets home might be an issue, and more concern is close to an intersection and sight distance. So, street names, no issue there. There is a waiver request that had been submitted the first time as well, that speaks to putting in the, sidewalk only on one side of the roadway. There is the asphalt, walking bike path, which is proposed at 8 foot in width. Honestly, I think that's a reasonable width for that. I think it's double what it was previously, or maybe it was 6 before, I don't remember. But
Yeah, I forgot that.
that is a waiver that is being requested. They have to comply with street signs, street lighting in this area is something that's also recommended. That would kick in a street tax in this, typically in this situation. Number 15, driveways are to be a certain amount away from an intersection. It appears there's 2 driveways that might be a couple feet short. I don't know if those could be adjusted shorter instead of asking for a waiver or not.
I asked for a waiver just to address the comment, but if it can be shifted, you can shift it. Maybe 2 on the corners. It was 48. So
I think you almost have to.
'68's pretty much all the building side. Yeah, I don't think those two buildings shifted.
So as shown, they would not meet the setback from the side street for the driveways. I think the concern you get into that is somebody's parked in there and the car is just at the end of the driveway, they could technically be blocking sight distance or, that kind of an issue.
Stops, it's stop, it's a stops.
Is it all
It'd be a stop
All way?
control intersection.
all way?
We can make it all way. That should, doesn't that deal with it, doesn't that satisfy?
I think you'd still need the waiver, but I think it's a justification for a waiver. Just,
I mean, we've done that in other areas, we just stop control of the intersection.
I think that's what they're trying to avoid, is not the stop control, but I think they're trying to avoid that being an issue with the intersection, but if you have a stop control there, then that might do that. I don't know, you'd have to look at that. Comment 16 just speaks to ADA requirements that are required. Number 17 speaks to the sanitary sewer authority. 18 is the same thing, the authority. 19 is comments received by the fire chief, fire commissioner. I think you touched on what we needed to on those. Storm drainage, we got into the discussion on storm drainage and what will be submitted. Electric utility, I don't think on a tentative plan that needs much more than just that's a comment. 22 speaks to, 22 speaks, there's gonna be an ENS and PDS requirement. 23, they need to meet the monuments, which I assume they will. I guess I take that back, there's a request for a waiver on the monuments.
I didn't include that in this letter, I don't know whether did we ever figure how many monuments were gonna be required or something?
I think we talked about putting them on, attempting to put them on one side of the road versus both.
That's pretty much what everybody's doing anymore because, you know, we need monuments.
So do we need to submit a waiver request on that?
Bless you. I don't necessarily know if it wouldn't meet the ordinance if you still put them on one side.
Let's take a look at it and see.
It's just, yeah, so the street may be readily defined in the future and meeting those, it does not say both sides. To your point, Gary, I don't think this is too far of a reach beyond what you kind of see on new roadways. The comment number 25, we talked about the traffic impact study. Comment number, or I'm sorry, 24, 25, this was a new comment speaking to what I was talking about on the roadways. There's kind of a two-part comment here that the requirement of a new roadway or an intersection should be at a 90-degree, and there's allowance for that not to be at a 90-degree, but typically with new construction, you really kind of have to start at 90-degree and justify why it wouldn't be feasible to put it at a 90-degree. And then further on at an intersection, it's required, there's basically a 50-foot section that's required to be straight and flat. Technically no more than 5% is what they're looking for. And where the drives are shown opposite the townhouse drive to make that a four-leg intersection, as well as where the drive aisle intersects Road B as you approach Main Street, it doesn't appear to meet that, the 50-foot straight area. And although it eventually hits a 90-degree intersection, it really doesn't hold that 90-degree for any distance.
Yeah, we're gonna meet that, Scott, we're gonna plan to provide that on the plan, so.
So maybe we don't need a waiver, but we asked for one anyway.
All right. We'll make sure Michael makes a note of that and how to address that in our report.
Based on the information you have, we need,
Yeah.
based on the information you have, we need a waiver. We get you revised information, maybe we don't.
Yeah, I mean, Chip, I know you submitted a letter with regard to some waivers, and there might be others. in order for the planning commission to weigh in on those waiver requests, I think it has to understand what the rationale is. I guess some of the rationales are driven by the density. Okay, go ahead.
Comment number 26. This just speaks to the second page where there's the small little circular area, I think it's kind of a square, all the way to the eastern end. That roadway, there's a couple issues with that, and they speak to the next few comments.
This one right here.
The separation of those intersections is 123 feet on what I looked at.
You go center line to center line?
That kind of,
Is that what you do?
we go curb to curb, it'd be less, but I think center line to center line is probably the way, that's the way I was calculating it
Yeah,
out.
we kinda looked at that, and it's more like 148, it's pretty close.
Yeah, we'll confirm that dimension. It is
My number
still
was
less
just
than
going off
150.
of what the stationing was, and I had a station that I could know for sure, and the other one I was kind of
Yeah, we're
guessing at what it was.
I think it's more than 123 though.
And we requested a waiver.
So there's a request for a waiver on the separation of those intersections, and then that roadway, as it goes around that open space, the minimum requirement on a local road is 150 foot, radii, or radius for each turn, throughout the development, it meets that. That roadway, as it goes around those corners, is 34 feet for the radius, so, it's kind of a significant change, and as they said, they're submitting for a waiver on that.
That was the same one though that we initially sort of showed everything squared off, right?
And
So this
it
was-
got rid of the width of the roadway requirements.
Right,
Um,
but created another issue.
Well, yeah, I think it was just, in general, it had the issue of the radii of the turn.
So again, I don't know what we can do to get to that, so. there's a
Even if
waiver on that.
we, at one point, we had that as, didn't we have that as a one-way road, one-way street?
Yeah, so if that becomes a service road or is one way, does that, would the waiver still be required for the radius?
I don't know if that's, I don't know if as far as the ordinance is concerned, if
The
that
ordinance
matters.
allows for that. I think the ordinance does allow for,
It just basically says to ensure adequate site distance, minimum centerline radii for horizontal curves shall be as follows. Minor streets, 150 feet.
But we can look at that and see if there's anything else to be done.
So it would be a consideration, yeah, I don't know where a one-way street would allow a different design requirement.
service street shall have minimum right of way of 24 feet, minimum car width of 18 for two-way, and 12 feet for one-way. I still don't know if we get to 150.
Yeah, I don't know, I don't think so.
No, yeah, it's too much.
I don't think we get the radius.
They have to be one constant mark on this.
Yeah, one markers are.
Comment number 8.
So that one I believe we already complied with, Scott, we verified. So the right of way width on this side of Willow Glen is already 53 feet. This side's not, we do provide half of 53, 26.5 from center line, so our side of the right of way.
So that one is on an existing roadway where there is development, the roadway of which there's frontage on a property. The township can ask for those improvements to that roadway to be made. It does not look like the right of way is an issue, it was just a matter of the width on Willow Glen, and, I can't say that it's consistent through there. I don't think the plans really define that, but right where it ties in and expands it to make it a 30-foot wide road, it shows it at 21.5, so roughly it would be a 6.5-foot widening of that roadway on the frontage of the property side. That is the requirement of the ordinance in this situation of which they're asking a waiver for.
Scott, did you have a reference to, we did see the provision for requiring the right of way, may require the right of way. Where is the provision for increasing road width? I think we were looking at.
I think-
We talked about that this afternoon.
I think it was 502(1)(e), was that the section we discussed?
That sounds right.
502(1)(e).
502.3 maybe? That's 502.3.
I thought I had it.
50, say that one again.
502.3.
5023 is the one I'm looking at. You were saying 5021E?
That's what was mentioned today, we had a phone call to discuss it, but I don't have the ordinance in front of me. That might not apply.
502.3 is the right of way, correct?
502.3 is street widths, minimum street right of way and pavement widths shall be as shown in other ordinances of the municipality regulating street, sidewalk, and curb, or if not shown in such ordinances, shall be as follows. So that's,
Let me have one more time. Was that in the, is that zoning or solid?
That's Saldo.
Stuck a sticky tab on it, and it disappeared.
yeah, I think that 5021E does talk about the dedication of right of way for a roadway to be widened, if the township would want that. I think typically you'll see that on, say, a rural road that's, say it's only 20 feet and you just have a 300-foot section of a subdivision or however long you want it. You get the right of way and does it make sense to widen it on that short period, or do they just wait until some future time? In this case, being just in town and being along the frontage of a road that's being widened and improved. I think the 502.3, the street widths, that's just how, that's how I interpret it for the minimum streetway as shown. And I think as they reference in there, the municipality, the street, sidewalk, and curb ordinance, 225, I think that speaks to the same situation where it is if you're improving, in a land development, if you're improving the property, the ability to have the frontage that you're on meet the minimum requirements of the street type as well. The next one really, comment number 29, that just speaks to it's asking that the biking path be moved a little closer to the intersections so that it can be accommodated by a crosswalk in front of a stop control intersection. It's a little more legal in that situation, and if that's what you're looking for, is to have that stop bar behind the crosswalks, and that's what it's asking for. It moves on to stormwater. I think we've talked about stormwater at this point. Traffic, I think to that point, there really isn't too much there to discuss. There's a few other comments, but they've acknowledged those comments, unless there's a reason to touch on those and go through them. General comments. I think we've talked about some of these other, the declaration of building restrictions and covenants to be provided. That's been acknowledged. Comment addressed for number 2. Comment number 3, I think we already discussed that at the last meeting, that talked about where to end the sidewalk near Highcroft. It was just to adjust it at the intersection of Highcroft Drive. I'm only kind of skimming through the comments here. If anybody has any comments they see that they want to bring up, but skipping down through 70. these comments. I don't know if there's any need for any further discussion. I don't think they have any impact on what we've talked about already. Number 11, and again, it's the review letters from the other agencies. Number 13, I think we talked about that and acknowledged that sidewalk along Road B and Road H don't make sense to lead it towards Main Street, except for the crossing on Road B where the signal is. There was a comment about street trees, some of them being shown within right of way, some of them shown outside of right of way, or whether or not there's a comment from planning commission on that.
We move them all the right way.
Hmm?
We'll move them all the right way. You know, it's in the right way.
Better. Comment number 16 was really just a layout of an ADA ramp on an intersection, making sure that it aligns properly. And comment 17, I think that's more of a, as they proceed into a final plan anyway. I know it.
Yeah, that 17,
Yep.
I think what we talked about, I think when we looked at that comment today, we would just go to the trail. Go to the trail that goes to the rec area and not continue up into Hycroft on the west side of the street.
Don't continue with
Not
it.
continue.
So you're saying
'Cause
don't
I'm sure
connect
that
the
shed's,
sidewalk?
I'm sure that shed's not where that shed should be. It probably doesn't meet your ordinances, so we don't really want to go into that. So we'll keep the sidewalk on the east side, bring the side, isn't that what we talked about today?
Yes.
We're gonna bring the sidewalk off the west side and
Terminate the sidewalk at the park. I think that's, I see what you're saying.
just eliminate, we could actually eliminate that whole side and put an ADA, ramp on both sides.
I would only think maybe you wanna bring it up on the park side to the entrance of that active recreation area.
That's what we talked about doing.
I think that's, I think it's reasonable consideration in there. If it needs to be. Again, I know that took a while, but I think it was kind of necessary where we're at. If the anticipation is to have a report prepared based on these plans and a recommendation from the planning commission. I don't know if there's anything that you guys wanna add, Michael, that you wanna add. I don't know if I wanna say really anything.
Gary, Chip, do you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I thank you for your time and input from me.
Okay.
No, I do not.
Well then, members of the planning commission, the applicant, we've raised the issue of whether or not the hearing will proceed on the 10th, and it certainly seems as though it will. The applicant hasn't suggested that an extension is forthcoming. So since we have to assume that the hearing will begin on the 10th and will end on the 10th, again, even though it's a practical matter that may not happen, I don't think we can assume that it won't. My recommendation would be that Scott and I work together to take what we've heard here, the review that Scott's done obviously already in the other comments that we have, and prepare a draft recommendation that the planning commission could then act on, edit, and then act on at a special meeting that would be held ahead of the 10th. It may even be that we can hold it on the afternoon of the 10th, before the hearing itself, as long as we have something that the planning commission has formally adopted and we can forward to the board as the planning commission's recommendation. Again, there are 3 different ways that the planning commission can go here. Can approve the plans as submitted. I think that it's clear that it's the conclusion of both me as special counsel and Scott as the township engineer that there's been insufficient information provided to allow the planning commission to recommend the approval of the plans as submitted. The other 2 options, of course, are to recommend denial of the plan as submitted. And if that's the direction that the planning commission would go in, again, I don't say this with any degree of joy, but I think that the absence of the information that we've laid out is necessary to allow the planning commission to make an intelligent recommendation. The absence of that information would be sufficient basis to recommend denial. And then if the third or middle way is to recommend approval with conditions, and if that's going to be the course that the planning commission takes, then obviously the planning commission would want to weigh in on each of the modification or waiver requests. So I am perfectly happy and comfortable to speak with each of the planning commission members offline, one by one, not assembled as a group, obviously, to get some further input and insight into which direction each of you would like to go, and then to prepare a draft recommendation based on those conversations. The other thing we can do is to prepare a recommendation that says the planning commission recommends approval with the following conditions, and in the absence of satisfaction with those conditions or compliance with those conditions, the planning commission would recommend denial. Or we can prepare 2 separate recommendations, one which would be a recommendation for denial and the other which would be a recommendation for approval with conditions, and then you can deliberate and decide which one of those you want to adopt when we meet again. That's the process that I see going forward. Again, the one sort of wrinkle here is, and again, I know I'm belaboring the point, but in the absence of an extension, we would need to have a special meeting of the planning commission, since obviously neither Scott nor I have the authority to speak for the planning commission.
Is there an opportunity for public comment?
Yeah, can we just close this loop here? And
Oh, I'm
then-
sorry.
Okay, yeah. I think maybe the way to work, if we want to speak with each of us individually, and then based on those conversations, we would decide if, a meeting is necessary, and then take it from there. Does it sound like a plan?
Okay, that's fine, yep,
Okay.
yep.
Michael, I have a quick question. If there's gonna be a special meeting, is there sufficient time for the advertisement and that? That might be.
Yeah, we could advertise it quickly enough, yeah.
Do we need to, we're looking at, if we have that special meeting, probably having it the 10th meeting, that's at what, 7 PM?
I mean, that seems logistically to make sense, assuming it would be convenient for the members of planning commission. You and I will be at the township building anyway that night, so we could always just have a special meeting of the planning commission before the board's hearing. As long as we have something that we can introduce into the hearing and have it be, this is the official as acted upon recommendation of the planning commission.
Yep, I think that sounds like a way forward.
I wanna ask one more question. If we move forward and there's talks of a revised plan, are we on what decisions we are putting together in the report for the planning commission to review? Is that gonna be based off of the plans that we have in front of us today? is.
I think it has to be, you know, that's what the planning commission has, seen. That's what you had the opportunity to review. I understand the applicant's position that there's gonna be a hearing, and it's an evidentiary hearing, and as long as they demonstrate compliance at the hearing, that's sufficient. But the recommendation that the planning commission offers has to be based on the information and plans that were submitted to the planning commission.
I just wanted to clarify, really.
Yeah, again, I don't mean this again, I don't mean this in a pejorative way, but in a perfect world, the materials that the planning commission had the opportunity to review and to base its recommendation upon would be the materials that the board is going to see at the hearing. But that may or may not be the case.
Okay.
So I think what I'm hearing is that I will have the opportunity to have conversations with each member of the planning commission one-on-one to get some direction as to where each of those individual members' thoughts might be in regard to the application and all of these issues that we've talked about. I will sort of aggregate all of those comments and prepare and Scott, I'll work with you to prepare a recommendation, a draft recommendation, and then circulate that, and then the planning commission would have a chance to formally approve or not approve that when we gather next.
Yep, that sounds good.
All right.
Okay.
Again, I want to thank you for allowing me to participate remotely. I guess we'll chalk it up to the better safe than sorry category.
No offense, but wise choice.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
Okay. There were some comments?
Thank you. My name is Sheila O'Rourke. I'm an attorney for a number of residents of the township, including Don Menya, who was here, Jim Robinson, and Virginia Rieger. And I come here to voice our opposition to the application that has been presented. And I'll be very brief. Your engineer's review and your solicitor's review were comprehensive, and there's no reason for me to rehash them. But I would contextualize that although it is called a tentative application, this is the township's and planning commission's main opportunity to dig into the application and provide comment. It is only at the tentative application stage that there's a public hearing. Even if there are revisions made afterwards, you heard from your engineer that there's not necessarily an opportunity for the public to hear and for an evidentiary hearing to be held. So this is really it. And the common refrain that we have heard throughout this meeting is that you simply don't have enough information to be able to make a recommendation on this application. Your solicitor and your engineer hit really critical and main areas of this plan, like stormwater feasibility, the lack of a traffic impact study, as well as the continued revisions to the plan that continue to be occurring, making this a real moving target for the commission to evaluate. There's also, and again, not to reiterate what's already been said, but the concern with open space is a real one. There are hundreds of housing units proposed for this development and very little cohesive open space. I would also point out that your PRD ordinance before the Berks Homes revision required 40% open space for a PRD. That's been further reduced by the ordinance that was adopted to 30%, and with this plan is disjointed and spread out throughout the development in a way that is not usable for the children and families who will live there. Lastly, I would like to point out that there is a pending procedural challenge to the ordinance that this application is being submitted under. That appeal is pending with the Berks County Court of Common Pleas. It's yet to be decided, and if the appeal is granted, it would make this ordinance void. And so any action that is taken by the Planning Commission or supervisors under that ordinance would likewise be void. Lastly, I would also observe that there seems to be a real rush to get this application in and decided, despite the lack of information and the request for additional information, which I think should give the Planning Commission real pause as to what they're asking to approve. Thank you, those are all of my comments.
Thank you. Yes?
Sean, I have a comment. Seems to me that all the information that Scott and Mike and these gentlemen here from Berks went over tonight, you're going to create a report. I don't think there's enough time, if you meet on the 10th, that the supervisors should have any idea of the impact of all that you spoke about, Scott. I mean, you know, we've just spent, what, 3 hours more? And to hand a report to the supervisors and expect them to glean what you want them to glean seems like an injustice to this process that we just went through tonight.
I believe maybe Michael can weigh in on this. I would imagine during the public hearing that would be part of the commentary or presentation. Is that accurate? I'm not sure.
It is.
Okay.
It is. At some point during the hearing, I would expect that Scott will testify, and have the opportunity to contextualize, to borrow the phrase, his review letters, and also I'll be able to, by introducing the report of the Planning Commission, be able to give the board some background as to how the Planning Commission reached the report that ultimately approves. And then, of course, the board will have, following the hearing, the board will have a period of time to digest everything that happened at the hearing and render its decision. I would not, well, let me put it this way. I'd be very surprised if the board is prepared to issue a decision immediately following the close of the record in the hearing.
Okay, thanks. Anybody else, or somebody's hiding behind I guess the last thing we had some other business outside of Berks Homes at the plan review chart. I don't know if there's any monumental changes on that we can discuss. No? And then the sidewalk map, we could defer that. 11 o'clock sidewalk discussion. Okay. That's all we have. I don't think we need to, we really need to make a motion.
Do we have to accept the extension for XPO or anything?
No, the board of supervisors took care of that.
Yeah, it was, the timing had it in front of the supervisors with enough time for them to act on it, and it didn't happen here for the planning commission, so. Yeah, you're good.
Yeah, they just have to bring in us the next one.
Everyone, I'm gonna drop off, but members of the commission, I'll be in touch with each of you through Joan, if that's okay. But I won't bother you before the holiday. So, Merry Christmas, everyone, and we'll talk next week.
Merry Christmas to you.
All right, thanks. Good night.
Is there an official motion?
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Okay, all in favor? Aye.